The history between the church and Cainhurst is the history of a relationship that the church ended violently, sending Alfred and the executioners to destroy the vile bloodline with a thoroughness that mirrored in miniature what it did to Old Yharnam. Maria came from the line that the church would eventually decide needed to be exterminated. She served the church that exterminated it. The internal complexity of that position was something she apparently chose not to examine too closely during the years when she was most active as a hunter. Maria's specific assignment to the fishing hamlet and what happened there is the event that broke whatever ability she had maintained to not examine that complexity. The fishing hamlet is a place where the church had established contact with a coastal community, a village of fishermen who had their own relationship to the sea and to the things that lived in it, including one of the great ones who had come to rest or be stranded in the waters near their shore. The villagers knew about this great one, had developed a relationship with it, had incorporated its presence into their culture and their understanding of the world in ways that were not the church's ways, but were not nothing. The church wanted what the fishing hamlet had access to, the Great One, in those waters, and the knowledge it represented were valuable to the church's scholarly program, to the ongoing effort to understand and potentially commune with the Great Ones and access their power and perception. The fishing hamlet stood between the church and what it wanted, not by choice exactly, but by geography and by the nature of their relationship to the creature in the water. What the church did to the fishing hamlet was done in pursuit of that access. And it was done with hunters, and Maria was among them. The villagers were treated the way Old Yharnam's beasts were treated, as obstacles to be managed rather than people to be negotiated with. The violence of the church's actions against the hamlet was extreme and produced consequences that the church did not fully understand at the time, because the Great One in the water was not simply a passive resource to be harvested. The fishing hamlet and its people had a relationship with it, and the destruction of the people ruptured that relationship in ways that had effects. Maria's role in what happened in the fishing hamlet was direct. She was a hunter, operating under church authority, and she did what she was sent to do. The law does not suggest that she went above and beyond in terms of cruelty, or that she had particular enthusiasm for the work. But she did it. She was there, and she did it, and afterwards she could not know what she had done. The item description of the rakuyo, Maria's weapon, contains a detail that is easy to miss, but carries enormous weight. She sealed her own blood, covered her hands in bandages, refused to use blood in the way that all hunters are trained to use it. This is a renunciation. In a world where blood is the source of the hunter's enhanced abilities, refusing blood means refusing power, refusing the tool that makes hunting survivable. Maria made herself a hunter who would not use the central resource of hunting, because the blood, after the fishing hamlet, was too connected in her mind to what the blood had been used to do, and what the blood came from, and what the blood required from other people. This is not a small gesture. It is not symbolic protest in the manner of someone who does not really mean it. It is a fundamental reconstitution of how she operated as a hunter, accepting greater vulnerability and greater risk as the price of refusing to participate in the blood economy that she had come to see clearly. Maria, after the fishing hamlet, is someone who had a reckoning, and let the reckoning change her in practical, costly ways. That kind of integrity is rare in any narrative, and particularly rare in Bloodborne, where the pressure of circumstances tends to push characters toward compromise rather than toward harder truths. Her relationship to Gehrman, who was her teacher and the person whose model of hunting she had trained under, becomes complicated in the aftermath of the fishing hamlet in ways that the law suggests but does not fully detail. Gehrman's relationship to Maria has obvious emotional depth. The doll is modelled on her, which means Gehrman valued her presence enough that when he was imprisoned in the dream, he wanted a version of her there. That is a significant piece of information about what she meant to him, about the quality of the relationship between them. But the relationship is not uncomplicated, and the complications probably increased after whatever happened with the fishing hamlet, and after Maria made the choice to seal her blood. Gehrman had built his life on the hunt, and on the workshop, and on the idea that what they were doing was necessary and could be done with integrity. Maria's renunciation was, implicitly a challenge to that belief system. Not a hostile challenge, not an argumentative one, but the kind that comes from seeing someone you trust do something that implies a judgment about the thing you have devoted yourself to. Whether they talked about it directly, whether there was an explicit conversation between them about what Maria had seen and what she had decided, the law does not say. The law rarely gives us the explicit conversations. It gives us the outcomes and the artifacts and leaves the conversations to inference. What we can infer is that the relationship between Gehrman and Maria, whatever form it took, was one of the most significant relationships in both of their lives, and that Maria's eventual withdrawal from the hunt and from Gehrman's world was one of the things that contributed to the Gehrman we eventually meet in the dream. Maria ended up in the astral clock tower. This is not a random assignment. The astral clock tower is a location in the nightmare of Mensis, one of the nightmare spaces that exist in the deeper layers of reality, beneath and beyond physical Yharnam, and Maria's presence there involves the same nightmare logic that keeps Gehrman in the hunter's dream. She did not choose to be in the clock tower in the way that a person chooses a job assignment. She was bound there, as Gehrman was bound to the dream, and the nature of that binding is related to the things that happened to both of them and to the entities they came into relationship with. What she is doing in the clock tower, from one angle, is guarding the path to the fishing hamlet and its secrets. The clock tower stands between the player and the access to the hamlet that the deeper nightmare makes possible, and Maria fights the player when they reach her. The fight is one of the most technically demanding in the game, and it has a quality that distinguishes it from other boss fights, a quality of the opponent not wanting to kill you exactly, but not being willing to let you pass without demonstrating that you have understood something. She has 3 phases, and each phase involves her relationship to blood. She starts without blood enhancement. She is beaten. She draws blood from her own hand and uses it despite herself. Because the situation demands it, and because the habit of survival goes deeper than the renunciation, she is beaten again. She calls on something else, something more extreme, and uses it and is beaten a final time. The progression is the arc of her life, compressed into a combat encounter. The refusal of blood, the forced return to it under pressure, the escalation beyond that into something neither she nor the player is fully comfortable with. After the fight, she falls. The way the game handles what comes after is quietly devastating. There is no speech, no final words. There is just the falling and the silence, and the understanding which you have if you have engaged with the law of what she was and what she went through and why she was here in this nightmare guarding this path to this secret. The game does not ask you to feel anything particular about it. It gives you the information and the space and trusts you to respond. The secret she was guarding, the thing at the other end of the path she dies protecting, is the knowledge of what happened to the fishing hamlet and to the great one that was in those waters. That knowledge is part of the game's deepest lore, the information about what the great ones actually are and what their relationship to human beings actually involves. Maria knew that knowledge. She had been there when the church acquired it through means she could not accept, and she spent her existence in the nightmare keeping it behind her, which is either the greatest irony of her situation or the most precise expression of what the fishing hamlet had cost her. She became its keeper because she could not become its destroyer. The doll in the hunter's dream, as a recreation of Maria, has always something slightly wrong about it, something that does not quite match the reality of who Maria was. The doll is gentle and accommodating, perfectly suited to the function of giving a hunter comfort and guidance, and the mechanical benefit of leveling up. Maria was none of those things. Not primarily. She was sharp and difficult and principled in ways that created friction rather than comfort. Gehrman's version of Maria in the dream is the version he needed her to be, not the version she actually was. And the gap between those two versions is a piece of information about how grief distorts the people we carry in memory. Whether the doll has any awareness of this, any sense of the discrepancy between what she is and what she is a copy of, is another of those questions Bloodborne poses without answering. The doll's expressions of care for the player have a sincerity that seems real, or as real as anything in a dream can be. She is not performing warmth. She embodies it, because Gehrman needed her to embody it, and that need shaped what she became. The tragedy of the doll is the tragedy of someone who exists entirely to serve another person's emotional needs, and who may or may not understand that that is what they are. The connection between Maria and the broader question of what the hunt costs the people who do it is one that the game traces through multiple characters, but makes most visible through her. She paid the price of clear sight in the most direct way possible, by acting on what she saw, by changing how she lived based on what she understood. Other characters in the Bloodborne narrative encounter similar knowledge and respond by going further into the system, by using the knowledge for greater power or greater understanding, by finding ways to rationalize continuing. Maria's response was to refuse. That refusal did not save her. It did not undo what she had done or change what had happened to the hamlet. But it was honest, and in the Bloodborne world, honesty about what one has done is almost vanishingly rare. Chapter 9. Gascoigne and the Hunt That Ate Itself. Father Gascoigne is the first boss in Bloodborne, which is not a coincidence. He is placed at the entrance to the hunt's deepest terrors, not because he is the most powerful obstacle, but because he is the most comprehensible one, the one whose tragedy is immediate and legible in a way that later horrors are not. You understand Gascoigne before you understand the Great Ones, or the Perfumerian depths, or the nightmare logic. He is a man who loved his family and hunted until the hunt destroyed him, and the understanding of that is not cosmic, it is human. It is the kind of tragedy that does not require any special knowledge of the game's lore to feel. But Gascoigne, when you start pulling on the threads, is also a piece of the larger story, connected to the workshop and the church, and Old Yharnam's legacy, in ways that add layers to what is already a powerful character portrait. Gascoigne was not born a Yharnam hunter. He came from outside, a fact that the lore marks as unusual enough to be significant. The hunters of the Healing Church workshop were almost entirely Yharnam natives, people who had grown up in and around the institutions that shaped the hunt. An outsider brought into the workshop was a rarity, which means either that Gascoigne came with skills or qualities that made him worth recruiting across the normal social and institutional barriers, or that the circumstances of his recruitment were unusual. His family, his wife Viola, and their 2 daughters, came with him or followed him to Yharnam, which tells you something about the nature of his commitment at the time. This was not a temporary assignment or a mercenary contract. He brought his family to the city where he was going to hunt. He was building a life in Yharnam, not just a career. The domestic reality of his situation, the dinner songs, and the music box and the daily presence of children in a hunter's household, is something that the game renders with unusual specificity. Most hunters in Bloodborne are defined primarily by their relationship to the hunt. Gascoigne is also defined by his relationship to his family, and the tension between those 2 definitions is where his tragedy lives. The music box, which his daughter gives the player if you speak with her during the hunt, is the key to understanding Gascoigne's end. The box plays a melody that Viola, his wife, would wind for him when the hunt had taken him too deep, when he had been out in the streets long enough that the line between hunter and beast was starting to blur in ways that the violence and the blood and the adrenaline produce in hunters who have been at it too long. The music would call him back. It was a tether, a reminder of something outside the hunt, and it worked. For a while, the hunt consumed that tether eventually. Viola was killed by a beast that was or was not Gascoigne himself, depending on a reading of the lore that the game leaves carefully ambiguous. The elder daughter went looking for her mother and did not come back. The younger daughter is left in a window in Yharnam, waiting, and what happens to her depending on player choices is another piece of Old Yharnam's legacy, playing out in miniature. She goes looking for her sister and is killed by the beasts in the streets, or she is given a red brooch that belonged to her mother, and believing it means her mother is dead, throws herself from the window. There is no version of this story where the younger daughter survives and thrives. There is only the question of which ending to the tragedy the player produces. The red brooch is the specific item that connects Gascoigne's story to the larger themes of Old Yharnam and the hunt's relationship to those it claims to protect. The brooch belonged to Viola. It ends up near or on Viola's body, which is near or in the location where Gascoigne killed her, which is either the act of a man already too far gone to recognize his wife, or the act of a beast with no remaining connection to what it was. The player's choice of whether to give the brooch to the younger daughter is a choice about whether to tell the truth in a situation where the truth produces immediate and irreversible harm. The game presents both the truth-telling and the concealment as available without adjudicating between them, which is consistent with its broader ethical approach. Gascoigne's transformation, unlike the transformations of Old Yharnam's citizens, was not the result of prolonged blood ministration over a period of years. It was the result of prolonged hunting. The hunt itself, the violence of it, the constant presence of blood, the way the kill instinct, once developed and exercised repeatedly, begins to colour everything else. This is what took Gascoigne. He did not become a beast through disease. He became a beast through occupation. This distinction is significant because it represents the second major vector of transformation in the Bloodborne world. The first is blood itself, the direct biological mechanism that the healing church managed so badly in Old Yharnam. The second is the exposure to violence and to the hunt as a sustained way of life, the psychological and possibly physical transformation that comes from doing what hunters do over a long enough period. Gascoigne represents the limit case of this second vector, the thing that happens when there is no longer anything outside the hunt to provide a counterweight. The music box was that counterweight. Viola was that counterweight. The family was the thing that kept the hunter from disappearing entirely into the hunt. The hunt is a total environment. When you are in it, it demands everything. The only way to sustain a self that is separate from it is to have something genuinely outside it that you are committed to returning to. Gascoigne had that, and then it was gone. Or he destroyed it, and without it the hunt closed over him completely. The boss fight with Gascoigne has a mechanic that makes it unique among Bloodborne boss encounters. You can use the music box to briefly stagger him during the fight, causing him to hesitate, to press his hands to his head, as if in pain or recognition. He is, in that moment, the man who heard that music and came home from the dark streets, the person who had a family and came back to them. The hesitation does not last. He recovers and the fight continues. But the moment is there, the brief window through which you can see what he was before what he became, and the game makes you choose whether to use it. Using the music box to stagger Gascoigne is tactically useful and emotionally horrifying in approximately equal measure. You are using his love for his family as a weapon against him, using the most human thing remaining in whatever he is as a tool for killing him. The game does not comment on this. It gives you the option and the consequence, the tactical advantage, and the image of his brief recognition, and lets you work out how you feel about it. This is Bloodborne's ethical pedagogy. At its most concentrated, the decision is yours, the weight of it is yours, the justification or condemnation you apply is yours. The game watches without judgment. Gascoigne was trained by the workshop, and the workshop's training included Gehrman's philosophy of hunting, as well as Gehrman's techniques. But Gascoigne came to the workshop as an outsider, and the philosophical framework that made Gehrman's approach sustainable was not Gascoigne's native framework. He absorbed the techniques more completely than the philosophy, or the philosophy did not take root in him the way it might have in someone who had grown up in the tradition. The hunt became for Gascoigne more purely about the hunt, without the layer of meaning and purpose and situational judgment that Gehrman's model required to sustain. This is not a criticism of Gascoigne. It is an observation about the limits of what any training program can transfer. You can teach someone to fight with exceptional skill. Whether you can teach them to sustain their humanity through the exercise of that skill is a different and harder question, and the answer probably depends more on what the person brings to the training than on what the training provides. Gehrman's best students, the ones who managed to keep asking the hard questions and holding on to something outside the hunt, were probably people who arrived with those capacities already present. Gascoigne arrived with extraordinary fighting capability and a family he loved And when the family was gone, there was nothing left to work with. The location of the Gascoigne fight, in a graveyard in the middle of Yharnam, is itself a piece of storytelling. Graveyards in Bloodborne's world are not purely symbolic spaces. They are places where the dead accumulate and where the influence of the dead on the living is concentrated. Gascoigne, in the graveyard, is in a space that resonates with what he has become, a thing that belongs more to the world of the dead than to the world of the living, that has gone past the threshold that separates them and cannot come back. The possibility that Gascoigne killed his own wife is one the game raises and does not resolve, and it is one of the more disturbing lingering questions in a game full of them. If it is true, it means the hunt did not just take him in the abstract sense of consuming his identity. It made him kill the specific person who was his tether to what he was. The irony would be total, the hunt using the thing that resisted it as the instrument of its final victory over him. Whether or not the game intends that reading, it supports it, and the support it offers is not accidental. Gascoigne's story is the smallest scale tragedy in Bloodborne, the most domestic and the most immediately comprehensible, and it is placed first in the game's sequence for that reason. By the time you understand what the Great Ones are, and what the Moon Presence wants, and what the Pthumerian civilization became, you have been prepared for that understanding by the much simpler truth of a man who hunted until the hunt ate him. The cosmic horror is easier to receive once you have felt the domestic horror. Gascoigne is the game's way of making sure you can feel something before it starts showing you things that are specifically designed to be beyond feeling. Chapter 10. The Upper Cathedral Ward and what the church became. The Upper Cathedral Ward is everything that Old Yharnam made possible, elevated literally and figuratively above the city that it emerged from. It sits at the top of Yharnam, above the Cathedral Ward, above the Grand Cathedral, above the formal institutional face of the healing church, in a section of the city that was deliberately constructed to be inaccessible to ordinary residents. The locked gate at the bottom of the ward's approach is not decorative. It is a statement about who is supposed to be here and who is not. And the answer to the second category is everyone except the church's most senior scholars and most trusted practitioners. To understand what happened in the Upper Cathedral Ward, you need to understand what the church was trying to do there, and why the events of Old Yharnam, Ashen Blood, the workshop, and the fishing hamlet were the necessary preconditions for that attempt. The church's founding project was medicine, blood medicinary, the healing of illness and injury through the application of Great One blood. This was genuine and good, and it was also, as we have established, catastrophically dangerous, in ways the church managed by burning the evidence and controlling the narrative. But there was always a deeper project running beneath the medical one, a project that the church's founders were probably aware of from the beginning, and that became more explicit and more consuming as the church's understanding of the blood's true nature deepened. That deeper project was communion, contact with the Great Ones, not just the use of Great One blood as a medical material, but actual relationship with the entities whose blood it was, access to their perception and their knowledge, and their way of experiencing reality, which the Pthumerian texts suggested was fundamentally different from human experience in ways that might be transformative if accessed directly. The Pthumerians had attempted this communion, and the results had been, by the evidence of the Chalice dungeons, civilizationally catastrophic. But the church was not the Pthumerian civilization. They had the Pthumerian texts as a guide to what to avoid. Surely they could do it better. The hubris of that position is clear in retrospect. Whether it was clear to the church's scholars at the time they were developing it is a question worth holding. Some of them probably saw the hubris and chose to proceed anyway, for reasons ranging from genuine belief that they had better information than the Pthumerians, to simple fascination with the knowledge that lay on the other side of caution. Some of them probably did not see it in the way that people deeply inside a project rarely see the shape of the whole thing from the position of one part, and some of them saw it and were stopped by it and chose to resist. And those people are the ones whose names appear in the lore attached to things that went wrong in specific and documented ways. The Upper Cathedral Ward was built to support the Communion Project. The architecture is significant It is elevated, separated, enclosed. The sky is visible from it in ways that the rest of Yharnam's cramped and dense design does not usually permit. The upper cathedral ward was built by people who wanted to be closer to something above them, who thought of the great ones as entities of height and sky and cosmic distance that required elevation and openness to approach. The architectural theology embedded in the ward is the theology of ascension, of reaching upward toward entities that existed beyond ordinary human perception. The choir, the faction within the church that operated out of the upper cathedral ward, was the institutional vehicle for the communion project. The choir's members were selected for their scholarly credentials and their physical capacity to interface with materials and knowledge that were dangerous to ordinary people. They were, in church institutional terms, the elite of the elite, the people who had been identified as capable of approaching the great ones without losing themselves, or at least without losing themselves as quickly as most people would. The selection process for the choir was not kind. The church's history of using ordinary people as unwitting experimental subjects, which began with the blood ministration program in Old Yharnam, continued in the choir's development in ways that were more controlled and more deliberate, but no less cruel. The specific experiments conducted to identify candidates for choir membership and the fate of candidates who were identified as unsuitable through the experimental process are documented in fragments throughout the ward's environment and item descriptions. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is the great one who became associated with the upper cathedral ward and specifically with the choir's communion project. She is one of the most complex entities in the Bloodborne cosmology, a great one who was abandoned or left behind when others of her kind departed, who was discovered in the Pthumerian ruins by the church's early expeditions, and who became, over time, an involuntary participant in the church's communion research. The relationship between the church and Ebrietas is not the relationship between worshippers and a god in any normal sense. It is the relationship between an institution and a resource that the institution has decided to exploit, even though the resource is also a being with its own existence and its own situation. The choir's methods for attempting communion with Ebrietas involved a degree of physical transformation in the practitioners that the church's earlier blood work had been building toward. The blood used in the ward was not the blood administered in the healing houses. It was older, more potent, drawn from the deepest and most dangerous of the chalice dungeon sources. The practitioners who used it were changed by it in ways that were visible and intended, ways that the church had decided were acceptable costs of the communion project. They were becoming something between human and something else, retaining enough of their human structure to function within church institutional terms, while acquiring properties and perceptions that ordinary humans did not possess. The enemies the player encounters in the upper cathedral ward reflect this transformation program. The church guardians, the celestial mobs, the celestial emissaries, these are not beasts in the sense of the Old Yharnam beast plague. They are the result of a different kind of transformation, one that the church conducted deliberately rather than accidentally, under controlled conditions rather than through the chaos of an epidemic. The fact that the results are enemies that the player must fight rather than allies or neutral entities tells you everything you need to know about how successfully the church controlled those conditions. 1. Reborn, the boss encountered in the lecture hall section that connects to the upper cathedral ward's approach, is one of the more disturbing pieces of environmental storytelling in the game. The entity appears to be a composite of multiple human bodies, assembled together into a single entity through processes that the lore implies involve the church's scholars and their experiments with communion. 1. Reborn is not the product of the beast plague or of the Pthumerian ruins. It is the product of the church's research conducted in the ward, the end point of an experimental line that began with the question of what human flesh could be made to become when subjected to the right combination of blood and will. The orphanage within the upper cathedral ward is the most explicit piece of evidence of the church's willingness to use the most vulnerable people available in its research program. The implication of the orphanage and the enemies encountered within it is that children were being used in the communion and transformation experiments conducted by the choir. The church, that burned Old Yharnam, without accounting for the children who lived there, the church that built an orphanage within its most secret research facility. These are not separate institutions. They are the same institution at different stages of the same institutional logic. The celestial dial and the mechanisms within the ward that suggest astronomical observation and calculation reflect the choir's belief that the great ones could be approached through specific alignments, that there were moments when the distance between human perception and great one perception was smaller, when the attempt at communion was more likely to succeed. Whether this belief was accurate is unclear. What is clear is that the choir organized significant research resources around it, and that the attempts at communion, conducted at the appropriate alignments, produced effects that the ward's current state reflects. The current state of the upper cathedral ward, as the player encounters it on the night of the hunt, is a place where the experiments have gone wrong in ways that are irreversible. The celestial mobs that populate the ward are not research subjects in the process of transformation. They are the result of completed transformations that produced outcomes the church did not want or did not control. The ward has been, in the terminology the church preferred not to use, lost, in the same sense that Old Yharnam was lost. The difference is that the church burned Old Yharnam, the upper cathedral ward. They simply locked and tried to pretend was not their problem. The locked gate at the bottom of the ward's approach has a key, and that key is found in the main cathedral ward below. The placement of the key in the lower ward, rather than the upper, is significant. The church kept the ability to access the upper ward from below, but made it a deliberate and specific act, requiring the retrieval of a specific key from a specific location. This is the architecture of controlled access, of a system designed to allow entry only to those who know specifically what they are looking for and where to find it. The choir's research into communion with ebrieters and the other aspects of the Great Ones eventually produced something that the church had been pursuing since before Old Yharnam: genuine contact, genuine exchange, some form of information or perception passing between the human researchers and the entity they were attempting to reach. Whether what was exchanged was what the church wanted is unclear. What is clear is that the exchange changed the researchers in ways that are visible in the ward's current population, and that the direction of those changes was not toward the enhanced perception and divine knowledge that the choir's doctrine promised its members. The failure modes of the upper cathedral ward experiments are different from the failure modes of Old Yharnam because the conditions were different. Old Yharnam was a failure of understanding, of the church not knowing what its treatments were doing until the consequences were too large to contain. The upper cathedral ward is a failure of wisdom, of the church knowing more or less what it was doing and deciding to do it anyway, accepting the risks because the potential gains were too significant to pass up. Old Yharnam happened because the church did not understand. The upper cathedral ward happened because the church understood and chose not to care. This is the trajectory the law traces from Old Yharnam to the ward. The church began as an institution that was doing harm through ignorance. It became an institution that was doing harm through choice. The transition between those two states was gradual, enabled by the successful management of each previous crisis, which taught the church that harm without accountability was possible, and therefore harm without accountability was an acceptable operational mode. Old Yharnam was the first lesson. The ward is what you build after you have internalized that lesson completely. Lawrence, the first vicar of the church, and the person most directly associated with the ward's development, is the figure through whom this institutional trajectory is most visible. Lawrence was there at the beginning, present for the founding of the workshop and the early development of the church's blood ministration program. He was also present for, or at least aware of what happened in Old Yharnam, and his choices in the aftermath, the choices that led to the development of the upper cathedral ward and the choir's communion program, were made with that knowledge. Lawrence's beast skull, the item that drops from the Lawrence boss encounter in the Old Hunters DLC, has a description that is among the most concentrated pieces of lore in the game. The skull is his, and it sits in the ward, and the description implies that he was aware, on some level, of the risk he was running with the ward's research, that he kept this reminder of what the beast plague produced as a check on his own tendencies. But reminders do not prevent choices. They just make the choices more informed. Lawrence, with the skull in front of him, chose to continue, and what the ward became is the result of those continued choices. The beast that Lawrence becomes in the boss encounter is not the beast of Old Yharnam, the kind that the workshop hunters learn to manage. It is larger, more extreme, more fully removed from the human body that it started with. The specific form of his transformation, with the upper body retaining more human quality, while the lower becomes entirely beast, creates a visual image that maps onto the intellectual architecture of his life, the part of him that theorized and planned and chose remaining in something like its original form, while what the choices produced was something else entirely. Killing Lawrence is one of the ways the game asks you to confront the gap between intention and consequence. He wanted to understand the great ones. He wanted to elevate the church's knowledge and expand what was possible for the institution he had built his life around. Those intentions are not monstrous in themselves. The monstrousness is in the willingness to let other people pay the cost of those intentions, the willingness to treat Old Yharnam's citizens and the fishing hamlet's people and the ward's orphans and research subjects as acceptable losses in the pursuit of understanding. The specific location of the Lawrence fight in the Grand Cathedral in the Old Hunter's Nightmare connects his story to the broader nightmare logic that we will be returning to throughout this video. The fact that he burns, that fire is the constant quality of his boss encounter, connects him to Old Yharnam more directly than anything else in the game. He is made of fire. He breathes fire. He leaves fire everywhere he goes. The man who helped build the institution that burned Old Yharnam is himself burning, indefinitely, in a nightmare space that the church's own ambitions helped create. Whether you read that as poetic justice or just cosmic coincidence depends on how much intentionality you attribute to the nightmare spaces and the entities that construct them. Chapter 11. The Healing Church Workshop and the Split That Made History. The split between the Healing Church Workshop and the powder kegs is not a footnote in the history of Yharnam's hunter culture. It is a foundational event, one that defined the parameters of hunter philosophy for generations, and whose consequences are visible in every hunter faction the player encounters. Understanding the split requires understanding what the workshop was, what the powder kegs believed, and what the specific content of their disagreement actually involved beneath the surface-level arguments about weapon choice and methodology. The workshop, at its peak, during the period of Gehrman's direct leadership, and in the years following when his students and their students constituted its core membership, was an institution that held a particular theory about what hunting was and what it required. The theory, which can be reconstructed from the trick weapons and the philosophical fragments scattered through the lore, held that hunting was fundamentally an act of tragic necessity, that the beasts were victims as well as threats, that the hunt's purpose was to manage an ongoing catastrophe rather than to participate in a holy crusade, and that the hunter who lost sight of this distinction was on the path to becoming something the workshop could not endorse. This theory was in tension with the church's preferred framing from the beginning. The church wanted hunters who were instruments of divine will, soldiers of a purification movement, people who could be deployed with the maximum of efficiency and the minimum of philosophical hesitation. The workshop's theory produced hunters who were thoughtful and effective, but also harder to manage, more likely to ask whether a specific operation was within the ethical framework that their training implied, and less likely to simply follow orders when following orders required setting that framework aside. The tension was manageable, while the church and the workshop were operating in relative alignment, while the problems the workshop was being asked to address were clearly within the scope of what the workshop's philosophy could accommodate. The beast plague, in its early and less extreme manifestations, fell within that scope. Hunters, going into neighborhoods and killing recently transformed beasts, was uncomfortable and philosophically complex, but could be accommodated within the tragic necessity framework. It was necessary, even if it was tragic. Old Yharnam broke that accommodation. The scale of what happened there, the number of people affected, the evidence of the church's direct responsibility for creating the conditions that produced the plague, the burning of an entire residential district with its human population. These were not things that could be accommodated within the workshop's philosophical framework without fundamentally altering it. The hunters who had served in Old Yharnam and survived with their understanding of what had happened intact were now people whose training told them to do something that they knew to be wrong, and whose institutional loyalty told them to continue doing it and not say so publicly. The powder kegs emerged from this contradiction. Their founding members were, the law strongly implies, veterans of the Old Yharnam period who could not make the accommodation that continued workshop service required. They took the workshop's philosophical tradition and extended it past the point where the church found it useful, pushed the tragic necessity framework to its logical conclusion, and found that the conclusion pointed back at the church itself as one of the sources of the tragedy being managed. The weapon philosophy associated with the powder kegs is relevant here. They favoured fire and explosives, weapons that were difficult to control precisely, that produced effects beyond their immediate target, that could not be used with the surgical precision that the workshop's standard equipment allowed. The church found this excessive and called it heretical, which tells you something about what the church valued. Precise, controlled hunting could be done quietly, could be made to look clean, could be narratively managed in ways that fire and explosions could not. But precision was also a kind of lie. Hunting was not a clean activity. What the church's hunters were doing in Old Yharnam was not surgery. It was war, and the powder keg's weapons were honest about that, in a way that the workshop's standard tools could be used to avoid. There is a reading of the powder keg's weapon philosophy as an aesthetic and political statement, as a refusal to participate in the fiction of the clean hunt, as an insistence that if you were going to burn things, you should use weapons that burn things, rather than weapons that could be used to pretend you were doing something more controlled and intentional than burning. The church's response to the powder kegs was characteristically institutional. They were labelled heretics, not for their philosophical positions directly, but for their technical choices, for using forbidden weapon types and refusing to follow workshop protocols. This allowed the church to marginalize them without engaging their actual claims, without having to address whether the workshop's philosophy, taken seriously, actually supported the conclusions the powder kegs had drawn. Heresy about weapon choice is a manageable institutional problem. Heresy about the church's responsibility for the beast plague is an existential one. The powder kegs never had the numbers or the resources to represent a serious institutional threat to the workshop or the church. They were a small faction of dissident hunters, and their historical significance is philosophical rather than military. What they represent is the possibility that someone who trained in the workshop tradition and engaged with it seriously could arrive at conclusions that the church found unacceptable, and that those conclusions could be maintained with integrity rather than abandoned for convenience. Dura, who we have already discussed, in relation to Old Yharnam itself, is the figure who carries the powder keg tradition into the game's present. But there were others, and the wider powder keg tradition that they represented shaped hunter culture in ways that are not always immediately visible. The hunters who did not join the powder kegs, but who had been exposed to their arguments and could not entirely dismiss them. The workshop hunters who heard the powder keg's critique and continued to serve but carried a new quality of doubt. These people are part of the story too, even though they are harder to identify in the lore. The split also had consequences for how the workshop approached its own internal culture after the powder keg's departure. The loss of the most philosophically active and questioning members of the community left a workshop that was more uniform in its approach and more aligned with the church's institutional preferences. This was not a conscious pruning, not an active decision to remove dissent, but the outcome was the same. The workshop, after the powder kegs, was a more compliant institution, more purely focused on the technical dimensions of hunting and less engaged with the philosophical ones, and the church benefited from that shift. The legacy of the powder kegs, in terms of hunter philosophy, is visible in the way the game treats questions about the beast's humanity. Multiple characters and items in the game take seriously the possibility that the beasts retain something of their former selves, that killing them is not simply pest control, but something that requires moral consideration. This seriousness, this refusal to accept the Church's convenient doctrine that the beast was simply a threat to be eliminated, has its roots in the powder keg tradition, in the people who insisted on asking the question that the Church preferred hunters not ask. The Old Hunters DLC, which we will discuss in more detail in a later chapter, is in many ways an extended exploration of the powder keg tradition's long-term influence, of what became of the hunters who carried that tradition and could not put it down and could not find a way to live with it peacefully. The nightmare spaces of the DLC are populated by the psychic residue of people who had specific things done to them and specific things they could not process. And the things they could not process were mostly versions of the questions the powder kegs were asking in the aftermath of Old Yharnam. The amygdala, the large entities visible throughout Yharnam, but interactable only under specific conditions, are relevant to the workshop space-keg split in ways that become apparent when you understand what they represent in the game's cosmology. The amygdalae are not beasts, and they are not great ones in the sense that ebrietas and the moon presence are. They are something intermediary, entities that exist at the boundary between the physical world and the deeper reality that the Church's communion research was trying to access. Their presence throughout Yharnam, including in the cathedral ward and above the streets of the upper city, suggests that the Church's research was successful in one specific way it probably did not intend. It made Yharnam visible to these entities. It drew their attention. The workshop's original mandate was to manage the beast plague. The plague that the Church's ambitions eventually produced was something different, something the workshop's original framework was not equipped to address. The hunters trained in the workshop tradition were, by the time of the game's present, fighting enemies that their founding philosophy was not designed to account for. The tragedy of the later workshop, and of the hunters who represent it in the DLC, is the tragedy of a tradition that was built for one world being asked to function in a fundamentally different one. Chapter 12, Mikolash and the Nightmare of Mensis. No discussion of what the healing church became in its later years can proceed without addressing Mikolash, and no discussion of Mikolash can proceed without addressing the school of Mensis, because the two are inseparable in a way that is unusual even for Bloodborne's tightly wound lore. Mikolash is not a side character or an optional encounter. He is the most visible representative of the Church's scholarly tradition at its most extreme. The thing that happens when the pursuit of Great One Communion is taken to its logical endpoint without regard for the self or others. The School of Mensis was a research institution operating within the broader Church framework, but pursuing an agenda that even the Church's other scholarly factions found extreme, where the choir sought communion through careful preparation and controlled experiments. Mensis sought it through a more radical approach, a direct engagement with the nightmare spaces that the Great Ones inhabited, an attempt to enter those spaces deliberately and conduct research there, the specific experiment that defines the School of Mensis and that produced the Nightmare of Mensis that the player eventually enters, involved an attempt to contact the Great One Rom, the vacuous spider, through a collective ritual that required most of the school's members to submit to a process that would send their consciousness into the nightmare while leaving their bodies behind in Yahargul, the unseen village. The bodies remained. The minds went into the nightmare. What came back was not entirely the same as what went in. The members of the School of Mensis, visible in Yahargul, are the people whose minds did not come back cleanly, whose bodies are still present, but whose consciousness is elsewhere, or damaged or divided, in ways that have made the bodies non-functional in any normal sense. The brass cage headpieces they wear are practical rather than decorative. They are containment devices, structures that prevent the madness from expressing itself in ways that would be dangerous to others. The people inside those cages were scholars, probably accomplished ones, probably people who went into the ritual with genuine intellectual purpose and came out the other side with something wrong that could not be undone. Mikolash survived the ritual with more of himself intact than most of the others, which is either a tribute to his particular constitution or a consequence of the specific role he played in the ritual. He is present in the Nightmare of Mensis as a recognizable person with dialogue and a personality, and a philosophical position which is more than can be said for his colleagues, whose bodies you can observe in Yharnam. He is mad, but his madness is coherent, organized around a specific set of beliefs and desires that are extreme, but internally consistent. What Mikolash wants is what the school of Mensis as a whole wanted: ascension, contact with the great ones, access to their perception. His famous line about the eyes on the inside and wanting to be lent great eyes is the expression of this desire in its most concentrated form. He wants to see what the great ones see. He wants the perceptual capacity that the great ones possess, the ability to perceive things that human senses cannot access. This desire is not incomprehensible. In a world where great ones demonstrably exist and demonstrably perceive reality in ways that humans cannot, the desire to access that perception is, in purely abstract terms, understandable. What makes Mikolash a figure of horror rather than a figure of aspiration is the cost he was willing to pay for that perception, and specifically, the costs he was willing to impose on others. The ritual that sent him and his colleagues into the nightmare required something from the great one Rom, required breaking the veil that Rom maintained to keep certain things hidden from human perception. The consequences of breaking that veil, the exposure of Yharnam to the full reality of what the great ones were and what their presence near the city meant, a part of what makes the night of the hunt the catastrophe it is. Mikolash chased you through the nightmare when you encounter him as a boss, because the nightmare of Mensis is, in a very real sense, his territory. He has been here longer than you. He has had time to understand the nightmare's architecture, to learn how to move through it, to use its properties to his advantage. The boss encounter involves chasing him through the nightmare spaces, and the chase itself is a kind of argument about the nature of what he found here. He is comfortable in this space in a way that a human being should not be. Comfortable in a way that implies he has become something partially adapted to the nightmare, rather than purely foreign to it. His death dialogue, when you finally corner and kill him, has a quality of acceptance that is unusual in a boss encounter. He is not surprised. He is not outraged. He talks about being unable to escape the nightmare, of going to the formless lake, of an inevitable endpoint that the encounter was always going to reach. He sounds, at the moment of his death, like someone who has been expecting this, who has been working toward it in a way he may not have fully understood, who finds in the final moment a kind of relief that the chase is over. The Great One he was reaching toward through the Mensis ritual, the entity that the ritual was designed to call or attract or make visible, is connected to the nightmare in ways that the law presents, but does not fully explain. The Mensis ritual succeeded in a specific and terrible sense. It attracted the attention and eventually the presence of a great one whose relationship to the nightmare was different from Ebrietas or the moon presence, more extreme, more consuming, more willing to use human beings as raw material for whatever purposes great ones have when they interact with the physical world. The Mensis cage, the large structure visible in the nightmare of Mensis, is the device through which the school attempted to enhance their communion. The specific mechanism of the cage, what it does and why, connects to the deepest and darkest aspects of the Church's communion research. Aspects that go beyond even what the choir was attempting in the upper cathedral ward. The cage operates on a principle that the law hints at, but that becomes clearer when you understand the relationship between insight, madness, and Great One perception that runs through the entire game. Mikolash is, in the taxonomy of Bloodborne's characters, a warning as much as an antagonist. He is what you become when the pursuit of knowledge is decoupled from any consideration of cost, when the desire to understand is not balanced by any humility about what you might find or who you might hurt in the finding. The Church produced him. The Church's institutional culture, its treatment of knowledge as a supreme value that justified whatever was necessary to acquire it, its history of burning communities and using orphans and destroying villages to access what it wanted, produced the environment in which Mikolash's particular form of ambition was a logical outcome. He is not an anomaly. He is a culmination. Chapter 13. The Old Hunters and What the Nightmare Remembers. The Old Hunters DLC is, among other things, a meditation on what happens to the people who gave everything to the hunt and were discarded when the hunt was done with them. The hunter's nightmare is not a punishment space in the straightforward sense. It is a space where things that could not be processed elsewhere found a place to exist, where the psychic residue of specific events accumulated into something that the game renders as environment and enemy and echo. The hunters who populate the nightmare are not simple enemies. They are people who were, in their time, the best at what they did. Ludwig, the Holy Blade, was the most successful hunter in the generation after Gehrman, the person who revolutionized the workshop's recruitment practices and made hunting something that could be scaled up in response to the escalating beast plague. Simon the Harrowed was a hunter who came to Yharnam as a pilgrim and stayed to hunt after his family was affected by the plague. Yamamura the Wanderer was a hunter from a distant land with his own tradition and his own understanding of what he was doing. These are not generic opponents. They are specific people with specific histories and specific relationships to the hunt, and the nightmare has preserved them in a form that reflects those relationships. The hunter's nightmare is, among other things, a museum of what the hunt cost the people who did it, and the exhibits are still active and still capable of killing you. Ludwig is the figure whose story is most directly connected to the institutional history we have been tracing. He was the person who transformed the workshop from Gehrman's elite tradition into a mass recruiting operation, who developed the idea that hunters could be drawn from the general population, trained to sufficient standard, and deployed in sufficient numbers to manage the escalating scale of the beast plague. This was a genuinely innovative institutional response to a real problem, the problem of the beast plague expanding faster than the existing hunter culture could address. The cost of Ludwig's innovation was a change in what hunters were. Gehrman's model produced a small number of exceptional hunters, people selected for specific qualities and trained intensively over extended periods. Ludwig's model produced a larger number of adequate hunters, people recruited from broader populations, trained more quickly to a lower standard, and deployed in greater numbers to compensate for their individual limitations. The quality per hunter went down. The total capacity of the hunter apparatus went up. This trade-off seems reasonable in emergency terms, and in emergency terms it probably was. The beast plague needed to be managed. The existing hunter capacity was insufficient. Ludwig's approach addressed the capacity problem, but it also changed the culture of the workshop in ways that connected to the longer-term trajectory of institutional corruption we have been tracing. The larger hunting force was more amenable to church control, because its members were less philosophically trained, less likely to ask the hard questions, more purely focused on the technical dimensions of the work. Ludwig's personal transformation, the beast he becomes in the nightmare, reflects the specific shape of his tragedy. He was a man who believed in the hunt as a holy practice, who brought genuine religious conviction to what he was doing, who understood the church blade he wielded as a symbol of divine purpose, and used it with that conviction. The nightmare has stripped away everything except what he was most essentially, and what he was most essentially was the hunt, stripped of the meaning he had wrapped it in. His recovery, when you fight him and in the second phase he regains some version of his former self, is one of the most affecting moments in the DLC. He asks about the moonlight, whether it is still there, whether the world he fought for still exists in some form. The question is not about the moonlight in any specific physical sense. It is about whether what he gave himself to had any reality beyond his own need to believe in it. And the answer the game provides, if you have found the church pick and show it to him, is one of the few genuinely merciful moments in the entire Bloodborne narrative. He thinks it is the moonlight. He goes to his death thinking the world he fought for was real. Whether it was is a question the game leaves open, but his peace at the end is not. The way the hunter's nightmare as a space echoes the history we have been discussing is significant. The river of blood that runs through the nightmare is not metaphorical. It is a literal river of the substance that the church used and misused and built its entire institutional identity around. And it flows through the nightmare space that the church's hunters ended up in. The excess of blood The thing that the church produced through its ministration program and could not contain or account for, is the fluid medium of the nightmare's existence. Simon the Harrow's presence in the nightmare is connected to a specific piece of information he carries: knowledge about the nature of the nightmare and its relationship to the living Yharnam, what that somewhere is. And whether it involves the preservation or dissolution of the original self is a question the game leaves open. Jura's legacy, in the context of Old Yharnam, is the legacy of witness. He was there, he understood what he saw, and he chose to remain and remember and resist the institutional forgetting that the church had imposed. The fact that the church considered him a problem, a heretic whose position contradicted church doctrine, and whose presence in Old Yharnam was an ongoing embarrassment to the official narrative, tells you something about the threat that witness poses to institutions built on managed history. The comparison to Gascoigne, another hunter whose story is wound through Old Yharnam's legacy in specific ways, is worth noting. Gascoigne is a hunter who was drawn to the hunt to the point of losing himself in it. A case of hunting becoming identity, becoming obsession, becoming destruction. Jura took the opposite path. He stopped hunting. He found the thing that the hunt was supposed to protect, or at least the thing he decided the hunt was supposed to protect, and he put down his hunting role in favor of that protection. The two of them represent two possible responses to the knowledge that the hunt is not what it presents itself as. Jura's story does not have a resolution in the conventional narrative sense. He is either killed by the player or he is not, and if he is not, he remains in his tower, watching as the hunt continues around him. Old Yharnam continues to burn. The beasts continue their slow, endless transformation, and Jura stands guard over something he cannot save, but refuses to abandon. That is the nature of his particular tragedy, the tragedy of the person who sees clearly and acts on what they see, and still cannot change what happened or what is happening. The emotional core of Jura's character is grief, not the operatic grief of someone in the middle of a loss, but the settled, habitual grief of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has organized their entire existence around that grief without resolution or relief. He is not paralyzed by it. He functions, he fights, he guards. But everything about him is colored by what he knows about Old Yharnam and what he was not able to prevent. Chapter 4. The Beasts That Remained. The beasts of Old Yharnam are not the same as the beasts elsewhere in Yharnam's streets. Spending time in the sealed district, paying attention to what you encounter there and how it moves and what it does, makes this apparent in ways that are difficult to articulate, but consistent. The beasts of Old Yharnam have been in their current state longer than any others. They have had more time to settle into what the transformation makes of them, and the environment they inhabit, the burned ruins of the community they once belonged to, gives them a context that the beasts of the upper city lack. The physical variety of Old Yharnam's beastly population is worth noting. You encounter beasts that are clearly more advanced in their transformation than the simple infected humans of the cathedral ward. Beasts that are larger, more aggressive, more fully removed from the human body plan that they started with. You also encounter beasts that retain recognizable human posture and movement, that attack in ways that suggest tactical thinking rather than pure animal instinct, that seem to respond to their environment in ways that go beyond simple hunting behavior. The ashen blood connection is central to understanding what kind of beasts you find in Old Yharnam. Ashen blood was a specific ailment that affected Old Yharnam particularly severely, a sickness that spread through the community in the period leading up to the Beast Plague, and that the church attempted to treat with its most aggressive blood administration protocols. The blood that was used to treat ashen blood may have been more potent than standard ministration blood, drawn from deeper sources in the Pthumerian dungeons. And the beasts that resulted from that treatment may reflect the specific qualities of that more powerful blood. The fire that burned Old Yharnam did not exterminate the beast population. It killed many, certainly, and it changed the environment in ways that affected the subsequent development of those that survived. Living in a burned environment in ruins, in the ashen char of what used to be their homes, surrounded by the physical evidence of destruction, the surviving beasts of Old Yharnam have been shaped by that environment in ways that are hard to measure, but probably significant. The question of what beasts experience, what their inner life is like, if they have one, is one that Bloodborne returns to repeatedly, without answering. The beasts of Old Yharnam in particular invite this question because they are old enough, and have been in their current state long enough, that if experience accumulates through the transformation, they should have more of it than newly transformed beasts. Whether that accumulated experience constitutes suffering, or memory, or something else entirely, is unknowable through the evidence the game provides. The blood-starved beast, encountered deep in Old Yharnam as a boss, represents one possible endpoint of the transformation process for a beast that has been isolated in the sealed district for an extended period. It is starved, as its name suggests, which implies that even the deeply transformed beasts have needs that can go unmet, that they remain biological entities with hungers and limitations rather than supernatural ones. The starved state it is in, when the player encounters it, suggests either that food sources in the sealed district have been depleted, or that the blood-starved beast's particular form of transformation makes feeding difficult or impossible. The blood-starved beast's design draws from the imagery of plague and contamination in ways that connect back to Old Yharnam's history as a disease ground. Its body is covered in substances that suggest the advanced stage of an affliction rather than the beginning of one, and its movements have the quality of something being driven by pain and need rather than aggression in the conventional sense. It attacks the player, but it does not seem to be attacking the player specifically. It is attacking whatever is available, driven by a deprivation that has nothing to do with the player's presence. The environmental storytelling of Old Yharnam includes evidence of how the beasts have been living in the sealed district. The bone piles, the scatter of remains, the way certain areas show signs of territorial occupation. These suggest that the beast population has developed a kind of ecology in the absence of human management. They have territories, they have hunting patterns, they have, possibly, social structures of some kind, though the law does not detail what those might look like. The sealed district is not just a repository of the church's mistake. It is a living environment that has been developing according to its own logic for decades. The elevated walkways and rooftops of Old Yharnam serve the beasts differently than they serve human navigators. The beasts are not using them for the tactical reasons that hunters would. Their use of the vertical space of the district suggests something more instinctual, a preference for high ground that connects to predatory behavior patterns, or possibly to the specific transformation these beasts have undergone. The beasts of Old Yharnam have adapted to their environment in a way that beasts encountered elsewhere in the game have not had time to do. The sound design of Old Yharnam, the way the beasts howl and move through the burned streets, creates a distinct atmosphere that sets it apart from other hunting areas in the game. There is something almost communal about the sounds in Old Yharnam at times, as if the beasts are in communication with each other in some fashion that the player cannot decode. Whether this represents actual beast society of some kind, or simply the game's audio design creating atmosphere, is a question worth holding. The connection between the beasts of Old Yharnam and the cult of the beast, the philosophical tradition that embraces rather than resists the transformation, is present in the lore, if not always immediately visible. Old Yharnam was one of the places where the idea that the beast transformation could be a form of power rather than a curse first gained traction, and the beasts of the sealed district, through their long isolation and their continued existence despite everything the church did to destroy them, represent a kind of living argument for that position. They were supposed to be eliminated. They were not. They persist, and their persistence is itself a form of statement. The pungent blood cocktail, an item that attracts beasts in Old Yharnam, works because the beasts respond to blood in ways that suggest their needs are still bound up with the substance that transformed them. They are not free of the blood's influence. They are, in a sense, still in relationship with it, still organized around it, still drawn to it, even in their transformed state. This ongoing relationship between the beast and the blood is one of the more interesting pieces of information the game provides about the nature of the transformation. The population of beasts in Old Yharnam has presumably been declining over the years as the sealed district's resources are consumed and individual beasts die from various causes. The population the player encounters is probably not representative of what Old Yharnam's beast population was immediately after the sealing. There would have been more of them, more variety, more interaction. What remains is the remnant of a larger population that has been filtering down over time to what is encountered in the game's present. The absence of any young beasts in Old Yharnam, any newly transformed ones, is notable. The population appears to consist entirely of survivors of the original transformation event, beasts that have been in their current state for decades. This suggests that the transformation does not regenerate itself in the sealed district, that the blood that caused it is no longer actively present in a form that would transform new individuals. The beast population of Old Yharnam is, in biological terms, a dying population, a remnant that is not reproducing and is only declining. Jura's protection of this population, viewed through this lens, takes on an additional quality. He is not just protecting a dangerous community, he is protecting the last representatives of something, the last survivors of Old Yharnam's human community. In whatever form the transformation has left them, when they are gone, the last living connection to what Old Yharnam was will be gone with them. Jura may understand this, and his protectiveness may be partly a response to the irreversibility of their loss. The lore items found in Old Yharnam include several that speak to the medical history of the district, to the ashen blood treatment, and the church's response to it. These items give the player pieces of the story that supplement the environmental storytelling and Jura's dialogue. Together they create a picture of a community that was being managed and treated and ultimately destroyed by an institution that understood what it was doing at every step, but chose institutional survival over human life. The beasts that remain in Old Yharnam are, in a sense, the most honest part of the entire Bloodborne world. They are what happened when the Church's calculations were applied to real human beings. They do not have the Church's ability to frame their existence in advantageous language. They cannot offer theological justifications for what they are, or historical rationalizations for what was done to them. They are simply the result, the direct physical consequence of a series of decisions made by an institution that was never held accountable for making them. The player's encounter with these beasts can be purely mechanical, a matter of combat and resource management and navigation. But the lore context gives every encounter in Old Yharnam a weight that is not present in encounters with other enemy types. When you fight a beast in the cathedral ward, you are fighting a person who recently transformed and probably had little idea what was happening to them. When you fight a beast in Old Yharnam, you are fighting someone who has been in this state for decades, who was transformed by a medical treatment they received in good faith, who was burned and sealed and abandoned by the institution that was supposed to care for them. The fire paper and bolt paper items, which the player can use to enhance weapons with elemental damage, are found in Old Yharnam in quantities that suggest the hunters who worked there favoured these enhancements. Fire paper, in particular, with its obvious relevance to the district's history, creates a dark piece of environmental commentary when you find it in the burned ruins. The tools of the hunters who burned this place are still here, still available, still useful for continuing the work of destruction. The beast roar ability, which certain enemies in Old Yharnam use to stagger the player, is something that the game teaches you to fear and respect. It is a purely offensive tool, a weapon, which in the context of who these beasts are and what was done to them, reads as something other than simple aggression. It is a voice, in a sense, the only form of communication these transformed individuals have, and it is a hostile one because every experience they have had with other humans has been hostile. The environmental details of Old Yharnam reward patient exploration. The arrangement of buildings, the placement of remains, the small details that suggest specific events, tell stories that the item descriptions and dialogue only partially cover. A barricaded door, a pile of bones in a specific location, a weapon left in a specific moments in the district's history that the game presents without explanation, trusting the player to construct the moment from the physical evidence. The smell of the place, if you could smell it, is something that Bloodborne implies through its visual design. Ash and char, the long-ago remnants of fire, overlaid with the biological presence of the beasts and the more recent smoke that still rises from certain areas. Old Yharnam has been burning for years, in various senses. The fires of the original purge never entirely went out, and the district maintains a quality of ongoing immolation that makes it feel different from the merely dangerous areas elsewhere in Yharnam. The Church's ongoing interest in Old Yharnam, suggested by certain law connections, means that the sealed district has not been entirely abandoned in an institutional sense. There are agents of various church factions whose activities touch on Old Yharnam's history or its current state, and the deepest dungeons beneath the district are still connected to the larger Pthumerian labyrinth that the church continues to explore. Old Yharnam above ground is sealed and forgotten. Old Yharnam below ground is anything but. The beast that the transformation makes does not appear to have a destination. It is not moving towards something in the way that the Pale Blood pilgrimages and Great One Communion experiments have a direction. The beast transformation is, in the framework suggested by the law, a degradation rather than an ascension, a loss of the qualities that make human consciousness possible, without a corresponding gain of the qualities that characterize the higher entities in the game's cosmology. The beasts of Old Yharnam are, in this reading, people who fell off the edge of humanity without landing anywhere. This is the most tragic reading of what Old Yharnam's beast population represents. Not a transformation into something else, not a change of state that goes somewhere, but a dissolution, a loss without remainder. The people of Old Yharnam did not become beasts in the sense of becoming something different. They lost the ability to be what they were, without gaining the ability to be anything else. They exist in the gap, and the district they haunt is itself a gap, a sealed-off absence in the middle of a city that has moved on. The beasts of Old Yharnam will continue to decline. There is no mechanism in the game's world for their restoration. Dura's protection, whatever its moral value, cannot reverse the transformation. The cure for the beast plague, if there is one, is not something that Old Yharnam's population has access to. They are past the point where any treatment could help them, and they have been past that point for longer than any treatment has been available. Their story ends, eventually, with the last one dying alone in the burned ruins of their neighborhood, and there will be no one there to record it. Chapter 5: Ashen Blood and the Plague's True Origin. The ashen blood ailment is the specific disease that swept through Old Yharnam before the beast plague, and understanding it is essential to understanding how the situation in the district went from bad to catastrophic. The name itself is suggestive. Ashen blood, blood that has lost its vitality, its warmth, its living quality. An ailment that attacks the blood in a way that leaves it grey and depleted. In a city whose entire medical and religious tradition is organised around the miraculous power of blood, an illness that attacks blood itself is not just a medical problem, it is a spiritual crisis. The Church's response to ashen blood was aggressive precisely because of this symbolic dimension. When blood was sick in Yharnam, the Church was confronting a challenge to its fundamental premise, the idea that the blood it administered was pure and powerful and good. Treating ashen blood with more blood, with stronger blood, with the most powerful variants available from the deepest dungeon expeditions, was the logical response within the Church's framework. It was also the response that accelerated the beast plague catastrophically. The origin of the ashen blood ailment is not definitively established in the law. There are theories, most of them pointing toward the Pthumerian ruins as the source, towards some contamination or influence that seeped upward through the geological layers separating the old underground civilization from the current one above. Old Yharnam's position directly above some of the most ancient and least explored sections of the dungeon network makes this explanation plausible. The district was essentially sitting on top of a source of contamination that the Church's own excavations may have disturbed. The Church's expeditions into the deepest chalice dungeons were not routine operations. They were reaching for knowledge and materials that even Pthumerian civilization had considered dangerous, going past the points where the Pthumerian texts recommended stopping, pursuing the kind of understanding that the Great Ones had always seemed to want humans to avoid. The ashen blood ailment may represent the consequence of breaching one of those boundaries. of awakening something in the depths that began to affect the population closest to it. The sick people of Old Yharnam, who came to the church for treatment of ashen blood, were not wrong to seek help. They were ill with something real and frightening, and the church was the only medical institution available to them. Their trust in the church, at this moment before everything went wrong, was entirely reasonable. They had seen the blood work miracles on other ailments. There was no reason, from their perspective, to believe it would do anything other than help with this one too. The initial treatments appeared to work. Ashen blood could be temporarily reversed or suppressed by blood ministration. The patient's vitality would return, their blood would regain its colour and heat, and they would feel better. This apparent success was the worst possible outcome because it meant more people sought treatment and more blood was administered, and the cycle of treatment and apparent success continued long enough to reach the threshold at which the transformation began. The relationship between ashen blood and the beast plague is one of the darkest pieces of the Old Yharnam story. The disease and its cure were working together to produce the catastrophe. The ashen blood made people sick in ways that made them more susceptible to the transformative effects of the blood treatment. The blood treatment suppressed the ashen blood temporarily while accelerating the underlying transformation. The church was treating the symptoms while the real process was getting worse, and the worse it got, the more aggressively they treated it, which made it worse faster. The church's scholars, if they understood this mechanism, were in a terrible position. Acknowledging it meant acknowledging that their entire treatment program was causing the beast plague. It meant acknowledging that every person who received blood administration for ashen blood and subsequently transformed was transformed as a direct result of the treatment. It meant acknowledging responsibility on a scale that was institutionally unsurvivable. The institutional pressure to not understand this mechanism, or to understand it only partially, or to frame it in ways that displaced responsibility, must have been enormous. The ashen blood epidemic in Old Yharnam was probably known about in other parts of Yharnam, at least initially. Neighbours and traders and family members would have known that something was wrong in the district. The church's ability to control information was significant but not absolute, and rumours of an unusual sickness in Old Yharnam would have circulated. What the church was able to control was the framing. This was a disease the church was treating, a manageable situation being handled by competent professionals, nothing to worry about if you were not in the affected area. The timeline of the ashen blood outbreak, the treatment period, and the onset of the beast plague is important for understanding how quickly things went wrong once they started going wrong. The law suggests that the period from the beginning of aggressive treatment to the point where the beast population was large enough to be unmanageable was relatively short, perhaps months rather than years. The acceleration was dramatic. The church went from treating an unusual ailment to facing a full-scale beast plague in a compressed time frame that left little opportunity for adjustment or course correction. The social dynamics of the ashen blood period in Old Yharnam are worth considering. An epidemic illness creates particular social pressures. People avoid the sick. Families quarantine affected members. Neighbours become distant. Trade and normal community interaction slow down. These dynamics would have been present in Old Yharnam during the ashen blood period, and they would have intersected in complicated ways with the church's treatment program. People who were isolating from the sick were also isolating from the church's practitioners who were treating them, which meant information about the treatment's effects was slower to circulate than it might otherwise have been. The church's healing houses in Old Yharnam, the local facilities through which blood ministration was administered, were probably the epicenters of the beast outbreak, precisely because they were where the most blood was being administered in the highest concentrations. Healing houses where multiple patients with ashen blood were being treated with powerful blood simultaneously would have been producing multiple transformations simultaneously, and the chaos that resulted when transformations began in what were supposed to be medical facilities would have been extreme and rapid. The people staffing those healing houses, the church practitioners who were actually administering the blood, were probably among the first to realize that something was catastrophically wrong. They would have seen the transformations begin in people they had just treated, would have had to make split-second decisions about what to do, would have become themselves targets of the newly transformed as the situation degenerated. What happened to those practitioners? How many of them survived the initial chaos? And what they reported back to the church is not documented, but forms an important part of the unwritten history of Old Yharnam. The beast blood pellets, an item in the game that temporarily enhances the player's beast nature, are found in Old Yharnam in a concentration that suggests they were used there during the crisis. The use of beast nature enhancers in a district experiencing a beast plague is counterintuitive on its surface, but it makes a certain kind of sense within the hunter culture of the period. The hunters working Old Yharnam needed every advantage they could get, and if temporarily embracing some beast qualities made you more effective at fighting beasts, some hunters were willing to pay that price. The ashen quality that the disease gets its name from is visible in the environment of Old Yharnam even after the burning. The ash that coats everything is not purely the ash of the fire. There is a different quality to the dustiness of Old Yharnam, a particular kind of grey that seems to go beyond what fire alone would leave. Whether this is intentional environmental design or simply the game's aesthetic, it creates the feeling that the ashen blood is still present in some residual way, still part of what Old Yharnam is. The church's documentation of ashen blood, if it existed, would have been classified among the most sensitive materials in the church's archive. Understanding ashen blood, its origin, its relationship to the beast plague, the specific mechanism by which blood administration treatment of ashen blood produced the transformation. This was the kind of knowledge that could bring down the institution if it became public. The handling of that documentation, whether it was preserved or destroyed, is an open question. But the fact that no item in the game gives the player direct access to the church's internal account of ashen blood is itself suggestive. The madman's knowledge items, scattered through Yharnam, point toward the way that certain kinds of understanding in this world come at a cognitive cost. The knowledge that the church acquired through the ashen blood crisis, the deep understanding of how blood and transformation and plague interacted, was the kind of knowledge that had that quality. Those who understood it most completely were the most deeply implicated in what had happened and were changed by that knowledge in ways that were not entirely rational. The church's most knowledgeable scholars were not its most stable figures. The practical elimination of ashen blood as a visible condition after Old Yharnam's destruction and sealing as another piece of the church's management of the story. Once Old Yharnam was gone, there were no more publicly visible cases of ashen blood to explain. The condition was contained, officially, along with its sufferers. Whether ashen blood continued to occur elsewhere in Yharnam in milder or better managed forms, or whether the sealing of Old Yharnam actually addressed the source, is unclear from the law. But the condition disappeared from the public record, along with the district. The relationship between ashen blood and the deeper Pthumerian law is one of the more speculative connections in the Old Yharnam story. But it is worth pursuing. The Pthumerian civilization had encountered the Great Ones, and the consequences of that encounter, in ways that resemble, at a civilizational scale, what happened to Old Yharnam at a neighborhood scale. The diseases of the Pthumerian world, the specific afflictions that their contact with the Great Ones produced, may have had descendants or echoes in the ailments that affected later Yharnam. Ashen blood could be one of those echoes, a condition that came from the deep ruins as a consequence of the church's excavations. The blood that the church drew from the deepest dungeon expeditions was not identical to the blood used in standard ministration. The deeper the source, the more powerful and potentially more dangerous the blood. If the church's practitioners working in Old Yharnam during the ashen blood crisis were using deep source blood because it seemed to be more effective against the particularly severe manifestation of the ailment in that district they were working with, material whose risks they did not fully understand, and whose interaction with an already compromised population they were not equipped to predict. The timing of the ashen blood outbreak, relative to the church's deeper dungeon expeditions, is suggestive. If the expeditions disturbed something in the ruins that contributed to the outbreak, then the church's pursuit of knowledge and power in the dungeons directly caused the problem that the church then made catastrophically worse by treating it. The institutional feedback loop here is total. The church's ambition created the disease. The church's treatment of the disease created the beast plague. The church's response to the beast plague destroyed the community. The church then used the destroyed community to cover the evidence of how all of this happened. The ash and blood story is ultimately a story about the gap between the official purpose of an institution and what it actually does. The healing church was supposed to heal people. When it encountered a disease it did not understand in a community that trusted it, it treated that disease with the only tool it had, and the treatment was worse than the disease. And the community paid for the church's limitations with everything they had. That is the core of the ash and blood tragedy, and it sits at the centre of everything that Old Yharnam is and was. The lore of Bloodborne does not tell you how many people lived in Old Yharnam before the ash and blood outbreak. The number is unspecified and probably unknowable at this point in the story's history. But it was a residential district in a living city, and the number was certainly in the thousands. Every one of those people who received blood ministration for ash and blood was set on a path that ended either in transformation or in being killed by hunters or in being burned alive. The scale of what the ash and blood crisis produced, measured in human terms, is staggering, and the church's management of the narrative has ensured that no one in Yharnam's present is counting. Chapter 6. What the fire left behind. The burning of Old Yharnam did not end Old Yharnam. It transformed it into something that in some ways was more significant than the living neighbourhood had been. The burned district became a symbol, a piece of the city's hidden history, a wound that would not close because no one was allowed to acknowledge it as a wound. What the fire left behind was not just ash and beasts and sealed gates. It was a set of questions that the church needed to never be answered, and a set of people who had come close enough to those questions to be dangerous. The physical legacy of the fire is visible in every corner of the sealed district. The char and the ash, the collapsed structures, the way the buildings lean and crack under the weight of decades of abandonment, these are the tangible residue of the church's decision. But the fire's legacy extends beyond the physical. It extends into the institutional culture of the church, into the hunter traditions that developed in the aftermath, into the philosophical fractures that the crisis created among those who knew enough to understand what it meant. The church's official position after the burning was that Old Yharnam had been successfully cleansed, the beast plague had been contained, the affected district had been handled, and the lessons learned would be applied to ensure that what happened in Old Yharnam never happened again. This position required the church to simultaneously acknowledge that something had happened, which was unavoidable given that an entire district was sealed, and sealed districts required explanation, while refusing to acknowledge what that something actually was. The hunters who had served in Old Yharnam and survived were a management problem for the church. They knew too much, and what they knew was incompatible with the official narrative. The church dealt with this in different ways depending on the individual. Some were promoted into sensitive institutional roles, where their knowledge could be absorbed and their discretion purchased with status and access. Some were assigned to remote or dangerous postings, where they were less likely to talk to the wrong people. And some simply died in the hunt, their inconvenient knowledge dying with them. Jura's case was different, because he did not stay within the church's management structures. He left. He went back to Old Yharnam and refused to participate in the institutional forgetting. From the church's perspective, a former workshop hunter living in the sealed district and interfering with other hunters who came to work there was a significant problem. But it was a problem without a clean solution. Sending hunters to kill Jura would have meant engaging with Old Yharnam in a way that invited questions. Letting him remain meant tolerating a living contradiction of the official narrative. The fire's legacy, in terms of the church's subsequent practices, is substantial. The protocols that the church developed after Old Yharnam were shaped by the specific ways in which the Old Yharnam situation had gotten out of control. More careful blood dosing, more rapid identification and isolation of early-stage transformation, more aggressive hunter response to the first signs of the scourge. These improvements were real, but they were all improvements in the management of the beast plague, rather than in the understanding of its cause. The Church learned to manage the symptom better without addressing the disease. The powder kegs, as a faction, emerged directly from the Old Yharnam aftermath, drawing membership primarily from hunters who had served in the district and emerged with a changed understanding of what the hunt was and what it was for. The powder kegs' heretical reputation came from their willingness to say publicly what the Church preferred not to acknowledge: that what had happened in Old Yharnam was the Church's fault, that the beasts were victims rather than simply threats, and that the hunt as practiced was serving institutional interests rather than human ones. The Church's response to the powder kegs was to treat them as a technical and disciplinary problem rather than a philosophical one. They were called heretics because of their weapon preferences and their refusal to follow workshop protocols, not because of their ideological positions. This framing kept the debate on ground where the Church had institutional advantage. You cannot easily argue against a hunter organization on philosophical grounds when the organization controls the definition of proper hunting, but you can marginalize them for using the wrong kind of grenade. The legacy of the fire in terms of Yharnam's physical development is interesting. The city grew upward after Old Yharnam was sealed. The cathedral ward, the upper districts, the elevated structures that dominate Yharnam's skyline as the player encounters it. All of this development happened after Old Yharnam was dealt with. The city was built on top of its own buried history, literally and figuratively, with the new construction rising above the sealed ruins of what had come before. The sealed gates of Old Yharnam are not just barriers, they are architecture of institutional decision. Someone designed them, someone built them, someone gave the order to close and lock them, and whoever that was made a choice that shaped everything that came after. The gates are massive and deliberate, constructed to be permanent rather than temporary, to communicate not just that access was denied, but that what was behind them was not coming back. The scale of the sealing effort reflects the scale of the institutional commitment to keeping Old Yharnam buried. The ash that has spread from Old Yharnam into nearby areas of the city, the grey dust that coats surfaces in the lower districts adjacent to the sealed gates, is a physical reminder that containment is never perfect. Something of Old Yharnam bleeds out into the rest of Yharnam. Even with the gates sealed, the knowledge that something is buried there, the whispered histories that survive despite institutional suppression, the occasional smoke that rises from within the sealed district, these are the ash that the Church has never been able to fully contain. The impact of Old Yharnam on Yharnam's religious culture was significant. The Church's theological development, after the burning, moved in directions that seemed to be responding to the questions that Old Yharnam raised without explicitly acknowledging them. The doctrine of the hunt as holy work, the framing of the hunter as a servant of a divine order rather than a municipal functionary, the increasing mystification of the blood's properties, all of these developments serve to make the questions that Old Yharnam raises harder to formulate. If the hunt is holy, then the hunting of Old Yharnam's beasts is holy too, and holiness does not require the same accountability that medicine or policy does. The nightmare frontier and the other nightmare spaces that connect to Yharnam's history are relevant to Old Yharnam in ways that become clearer as the player progresses through the game. The nightmare spaces are places where echoes of past events accumulate, where things that happened in the physical world leave traces in a deeper layer of reality. Old Yharnam's events, the scale of the suffering, the specific quality of what happened there, would have left traces of this kind, and those traces are part of the deeper lore architecture that the game builds toward in its later sections. The chalk and ash and burned remnants scattered through Old Yharnam include remnants that suggest religious or ritualistic activity, markings and arrangements that were not produced by the fire itself, but by the people who were there before and possibly after the burning. Whether these are signs of the beast-embracing philosophy's rituals, remnants of the Church's own ritual work during the crisis, or something else entirely, they suggest that Old Yharnam was a place where people were reaching for frameworks to make sense of what was happening to them, and that the frameworks they reached for were not always the Church's approved ones. The fire's legacy, in terms of the game's present, is most visible in what Old Yharnam has become as an environment. It is one of the most desolate areas in a game full of desolate areas, with a particular quality of abandonment that distinguishes it from areas that are simply dangerous or cursed. Old Yharnam feels empty in a specific way, the emptiness of a place that used to be full and is not anymore, where the fullness was removed violently and the violence has not been processed or acknowledged or mourned. The player's movement through Old Yharnam, if they have done the reading and understand what the district was, carries a different quality than movement through other areas. Every building is a former home, every beast is a former resident, every piece of ash is the residue of the church's decision. The game does not demand that the player experience it this way, does not explicitly frame the experience to produce this response, but it makes it possible for a player who has engaged with the lore to have that experience, and the effect when it happens is considerable. The hunters who pass through Old Yharnam in the game's present, other than Jura, are treating it as a functional hunting ground, a place where blood echoes can be accumulated and enemies can be killed. This purely instrumental relationship to the district is, in miniature, a replay of the church's instrumental relationship to it during the crisis. The hunters in Old Yharnam do not see a neighbourhood, they see a dungeon. The difference between those two ways of seeing is, in some sense, the whole of what this story is about. The Gatling gun that Jura uses, large and devastating in position to cover the entire district, is a weapon designed for mass killing rather than for the precision work of individual beast hunting. Jura has chosen a weapon that is suited to the nature of what he is doing, defending against multiple attackers at once, protecting a large area rather than engaging individual targets. The choice of weapon reflects a different understanding of what the situation in Old Yharnam requires, a defensive rather than offensive posture, protection rather than extermination. The fire's final legacy may be the most abstract, but also the most important. Old Yharnam demonstrated that the healing church could destroy a community, seal the evidence, control the narrative, and continue to function with full institutional legitimacy. This demonstration, once made, could not be unmade. The church had proven to itself, and to those within it who were paying attention, that this was possible, that the stakes of their power could include this without consequences. The absence of accountability for Old Yharnam made every subsequent abuse of power more thinkable. The trajectory of the church from Old Yharnam to the upper cathedral ward to the night of the hunt is a trajectory of escalating willingness to sacrifice people in pursuit of institutional and scholarly goals. Each step on that trajectory was made possible by the previous step, and the first step was Old Yharnam. Not because Old Yharnam made the church evil. The church was already capable of the choices that produced Old Yharnam, but because Old Yharnam proved that those choices had no consequences, and that proof changed what the church was willing to do next. The smoke that rises from Old Yharnam in the game's present is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact of the game world, something that any Yharnam resident could see from the right vantage point. Something is still burning in Old Yharnam. Whether that is the remnant of a fire set decades ago, or a fire that is somehow self-sustaining, or whether it represents something stranger about the nature of the sealed district. The game does not explain, but the smoke is there, rising above the sealed gates, visible from the city above. And if anyone in Yharnam's present were inclined to look at it and ask what it meant, they would be asking the right question. What the fire left behind, in the most fundamental sense, is the answer to that question. The answer is, this is what we are. This is what the church is, what Yharnam is, what the hunt is, what the blood is. Old Yharnam is not a tragedy from the past. It is the origin of the present, the moment when the thing that Yharnam was going to become was decided. Everything after it is a consequence. The smoke that rises from the sealed district is not a remnant. It is a warning, still burning, still visible, that no one in the city above has chosen to read. If you are just joining us, I would strongly recommend going back and watching the previous video in this series, which covers Old Yharnam in full, because everything we are about to discuss grows out of that foundation. The decisions made in Old Yharnam The fire, the ceiling, the institutional calculus that made both of those things possible, those decisions, produced the people and the places, and the philosophical fractures we are going to be spending the next several hours inside of. You can follow along without that context, but you will feel the weight of what we are talking about more clearly if you have it. A few words about method before we begin. The territory we are entering now is, in some ways, more contested than Old Yharnam. Old Yharnam's broad strokes are fairly well established in the law. What happened there, who was responsible, what the consequences were. These things are supported by enough item descriptions and environmental details that the interpretation, while never certain, has a relatively solid foundation. The figures we are going to be discussing now, Gehrman, Maria, Gascoigne, and the institutions that shaped them, sit in a part of the law where the game is more deliberately opaque. The deliberate opacity is itself meaningful, and I will try to flag when I am working from solid ground and when I am working from inference. The distinction matters, and I think you deserve to know which mode I am in at any given moment. What I can promise is that I have spent a very long time with this material. These are not casual readings. Every interpretive claim I make here is one I have tested against the available evidence, considered from multiple angles, and in many cases revised substantially from earlier versions of my thinking. Where I am uncertain, I will tell you. Where I think the evidence points clearly, I will tell you that too. And where I think the law is being intentionally withholding, I will try to explain why the withholding itself is part of what the game is communicating. Let us get into it. Chapter 7, Gehrman and the Shape of a Hunter's Life. Gehrman is the oldest figure in the Bloodborne narrative whose history we can partially reconstruct, and he is also one of the most tragic, which, in a game that runs almost entirely on tragedy, is saying something. He is the first hunter. That title is not ceremonial. It means something precise and awful, and understanding what it means requires understanding not just who Gehrman was, but what the healing church needed a hunter to be when it first decided that hunting was a thing that needed to exist as a formal practice. Before Gehrman, there was no hunt in the organized sense. There were people who killed beasts, practitioners of the church, and hired muscle and desperate volunteers. But there was no systematic institution built around the practice, no formal training, no recognized role. The beast problem was managed the way most problems in Yharnam were managed, in the early period, informally, reactively, by whoever was available and willing. The results were predictably inconsistent. The decision to formalize hunting into an institution, to create what became the Healing Church Workshop, was made in the period following the earliest manifestations of the beast plague, which the Old Yharnam situation would eventually turn catastrophic, but which had precursors in smaller outbreaks that the church handled through improvised means. The church needed hunters who were consistent, who could be trained and equipped and deployed and trusted to perform, who would not make the situation worse through incompetence or panic, and who could be managed institutionally in ways that ad hoc volunteers could not. Gehrman was, in the law's suggestion, already a skilled fighter and already involved in the church's early beast management efforts before the workshop was formally established. The specifics of his background before hunting are not given, but the way the law treats him suggests someone who came to the hunt with existing skills and existing philosophical questions that the hunt environment intensified rather than created. He was not made by the workshop. He was someone the workshop was built around. The workshop's founding, under Gehrman's guidance, produced a specific philosophy of hunting that bears his imprint and that can be distinguished from the approaches that came later. Gehrman's style, as reflected in the trick weapons associated with him, and the burial blade in particular, emphasized adaptability, the ability to shift between modes of attack and defense as circumstances demanded. The trick weapon concept, a weapon that could transform into different configurations for different purposes, is a philosophy made physical. It is the philosophy of a person who did not believe that any single approach was adequate to the problem, who had probably seen single approach hunters die because the beast they were facing required something different than the tool they had committed to. This philosophical flexibility extended beyond weapons. Gehrman's approach to the hunt, as reconstructed from the law, involved a degree of situational judgment that later workshop training attempted to codify and regularize. Gehrman made decisions. He assessed situations and responded to them specifically rather than following a protocol. This was effective. It produced a hunter who was remarkably dangerous across a wide range of situations, but it was also difficult to teach directly. What you could teach were the techniques. The judgment was harder to transfer. And the hunters who trained under Gehrman were not all Gehrman. The church valued Gehrman for his effectiveness and for his institutional reliability. He was not a questioner in the way that the Old Yharnam veterans would later become. The law suggests that Gehrman, particularly in his earlier years, had a relationship to the church's authority that was more accepting, that he understood the institutional framework he was operating within and worked within it rather than against it. This is not the same as being naive. Gehrman was not naive, but there is a difference between the person who knows the institution is compromised and continues to serve it, and the person who has not yet encountered the specific evidence that makes the institution's compromises undeniable. Early Gehrman appears to have been closer to the latter. The question of when Gehrman learned what the church actually was, when he encountered the specific evidence that forced the reckoning, is one that the law does not answer directly, but the trajectory of his life suggests that a reckoning happened, that something transformed him from the first hunter into the figure the player encounters in the hunter's dream, and that the transformation was not gradual or peaceful. It was the kind of change that breaks something in a person and then requires the rest of that person's existence to accommodate. The hunter's dream itself is the product of that reckoning, and we will return to it in detail. But before we can understand the dream, we need to understand the workshop that preceded it and the woman who was at its center. The doll in the hunter's dream is not just a comfort object or a mechanical device for leveling up. She is a portrait of someone, a recreation of a person, who was important enough to Gehrman that he asked the moon presence to instantiate her in the dream space he was being drawn into. The person the doll is modeled on is Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, and the relationship between Gehrman and Maria is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of lore in the entire game. It is constructed carefully precisely because it needs to support a tremendous amount of weight while remaining ambiguous enough that it does not collapse into simple categories. We will get to Maria, but first we need to understand what Gehrman was before Maria, because what he was before defines the full scale of what their relationship cost him. Gehrman, as the first hunter, built the workshop from the ground up. He developed the techniques, the weapons, the training protocols, the institutional culture. He took the informal practice of beast killing and turned it into a craft with a tradition and a body of knowledge. This is creative and generative work, the kind that leaves a mark on everything that follows. And Gehrman's mark on hunter culture is deep enough that it persists even in the game's present in forms that have been distorted and degraded by time and institutional pressure. The hunters who trained under Gehrman directly were different from later generations. They had access to him in a way that gave them something that could not be codified and transmitted through formal training, a sense of what the work was really for, what it meant, why it mattered. Gehrman believed that the hunt was necessary and that the people who did it should understand why it was necessary. He was not interested in producing obedient killers. He was interested in producing people who understood the gravity of what they were doing and could sustain themselves psychologically through the weight of it. This approach produced hunters who were, by various accounts in the lore, exceptionally effective. But it also produced hunters who asked questions that later institutional culture found inconvenient. The workshop under Gehrman was a place where philosophical discussion about the nature of the hunt was considered appropriate, where a hunter could wonder whether what they were doing was right, without being considered dangerously insubordinate. The tension between that culture and the church's preference for hunters who were tools rather than thinkers would eventually produce the fractures that the Old Yharnam crisis broke open. Gehrman's later years, after whatever happened that led to his imprisonment in the hunter's dream, represent a different kind of existence than the vital and creative period of the workshop's founding. The figure the player encounters in the dream is old in ways that go beyond chronology. He is worn down by something that is not quite fatigue and not quite grief, though it has qualities of both. He is someone who's been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and who has not given up exactly, but settled into the weight in a way that is no longer about the possibility of putting it down. The wheelchair is significant. Gehrman in the dream is physically diminished, dependent on a chair to move around the space he inhabits. The workshop that he built and ran was a place of physical training and physical excellence, and his current condition represents a fall from that in terms that are hard to read as purely metaphorical. Something happened to Gehrman's body as well as his spirit, and the two things are probably connected. His dialogue with the player has the quality of someone performing a role they have performed so many times that the performance has become the only way they can access what is real in what they are saying. He is the guide of the dream, the person who orients new hunters to what the hunt is and what they need to do and how the dream works. He has said these things before, many times. The weariness in his voice is the weariness of a person who cannot stop doing something that has ceased to have meaning for them, which is its own particular kind of torment. The ending sequence, if the player chooses to end the dream and put Gehrman out of his long service, has a quality that is unusual in Bloodborne, which is not a game that deals in uncomplicated mercy. The option to release Gehrman is presented as genuinely merciful, as giving him something he has been wanting and unable to ask for, and the response is one of the most affecting moments in a game full of affecting moments. He thanks you. He talks about being able to dream himself, to have dreams of his own rather than being the perpetual custodian of others' dreams. The simplicity of what he wants, to dream, is devastating in context. To understand why the hunter's dream exists, why Gehrman is in it, and why he cannot leave on his own, we need to understand the moon presence and Gehrman's relationship to it. The moon presence is one of the great ones, the category of entities whose blood and influence are behind everything that has gone wrong in Yharnam. It is the entity that the hunter's dream is constructed under and through, and its relationship with Gehrman is a transaction that went badly, though the exact terms of the transaction and how it went badly are among the most debated pieces of lore in the game. What appears to have happened is something like this. Gehrman, at a point in his life after the workshop period, and after whatever experience with Maria changed him, encountered or was drawn into relationship with the moon presence. The moon presence offered him something, or took something from him, or both, in a way that resulted in his binding to the hunter's dream. He was given the role of first hunter in a different and more literal sense. The first hunter of the dream cycle, the person who greets each new hunter who is drawn in, and guides them and releases them when the hunt is done, and receives the next one. This role is eternal, or near enough. The dream cycles, hunters, come and go. Gehrman remains. He watches each hunter struggle with the same things, make the same mistakes in different configurations, encounter the same horrors in different forms, and eventually either be consumed by the hunt or succeed in some version of the hunt's goals, and then the cycle begins again. Gehrman has been at the center of this for long enough that the number of cycles is not something the law makes possible to calculate. Why he agreed to this, if he agreed in any meaningful sense, is unclear. The moon presence's relationship to human consent is not one that maps cleanly onto ordinary notions of agreement and choice, but there is something in the way Gehrman talks about his situation that suggests he understood, on some level, what he was getting into, and chose it anyway, or at least did not refuse it in the way that refusing might have been possible. The question of why someone would accept eternal servitude to a cosmic entity as the custodian of a nightmare hunting ground is the question at the center of Gehrman's character. And the answer is Maria. This is where we need to talk about her properly. Chapter 8, Lady Maria and the Cost of Clear Sight. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower is, by the evidence of her weapons and her armor and her posture in the lore, one of the most accomplished hunters in the game's history. She is a student of Gehrman's, trained at the workshop during its founding period, and she carries the marks of that training in everything about her. The rakuyo, her weapon, is an elegant and demanding choice, a paired weapon that requires precise technique and timing to use effectively, the opposite of a weapon chosen for brute force. Maria is a hunter in the German tradition of intelligence and adaptability applied to violence. She is also a descendant of the Cainhurst line, which is one of the most loaded pieces of biographical information the game provides about her. Because Cainhurst and the Healing Church are not simply in tension, they are in a relationship that went from cooperation to opposition to outright destruction, and Maria's identity as both a Cainhurst heir and a church hunter is a contradiction that she seems to have lived with uncomfortably and ultimately could not sustain. The Cainhurst vile bloods are, in church doctrine, the most corrupt form of blood user. People who took the wrong blood from the wrong source and became something that the church defines as antithetical to its own practices and values. There is a part of Yharnam that the church sealed off, burned, and tried to erase from memory. And the story of why that happened is one of the most tragic and disturbing threads in all of Bloodborne. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a little bit about why I made this video. Old Yharnam is one of those areas that a lot of players run through pretty quickly because it is dark, it is dangerous, and Jura is shooting at you from a tower the whole time. But when I started pulling on the lore threads, I realized that this place is basically the origin point of everything that went wrong in Yharnam. The Scourge, the church's response to it, the way blood ministration was handled, the beastly plague, all of it traces back here. One choice I made when putting this together was to lean into the human stories rather than just cataloguing beasts and factions. There are actual people buried in this lore, and I wanted to make sure those people were front and center. I also deliberately reordered some of the item descriptions to build a cleaner timeline, because the game gives you the information scattered across a dozen different sources. What you are about to hear is my interpretation of events, built from item descriptions, NPC dialogue, environmental storytelling, and some careful reading between the lines. Not every piece fits perfectly, and where things are ambiguous, I will tell you that. Let us get into it. Chapter 1. The City Before the Fire. Old Yharnam was not always old. There was a time when it was simply Yharnam, or at least the earliest settled district of it, a place where people built homes and worked trades, and probably did not think much about the cosmos, or blood, or ancient gods sleeping beneath the earth. The geography of the area suggests it was one of the first parts of the city to be developed, sitting lower than the later districts, cramped and layered and dense in the way that old neighborhoods get when they have been built over and repaired and built over again for generations. The architecture has that quality of accumulated time where you can see different eras stacked on top of each other in the same wall. The people who lived here before the Scourge were largely lower class by Yharnam standards. The buildings are narrow and close together, the streets are winding and difficult to navigate, and the whole district has the feeling of a place that was never quite wealthy enough to be renovated into something cleaner. This matters because it helps explain why the district became ground zero for the beast plague. Crowded living conditions, shared resources, close physical contact. These are the conditions under which disease spreads fastest, and the Scourge, whatever its ultimate supernatural nature, behaved in many ways like a disease in its early stages. Blood ministration had already come to Yharnam by this point. The Healing Church had established itself as the dominant religious and medical institution in the region, and its practitioners were offering the blood of pale blood, the strange and powerful substance derived from the Great Ones and the old labyrinthine ruins beneath the city, as a cure for illness and injury. The results were remarkable. People who had been dying of ordinary ailments were recovering. Word spread. Pilgrims began arriving from other countries seeking treatment, and Yharnam became known across the known world as a place of miraculous healing. The citizens of the district that would become Old Yharnam were among the earliest recipients of blood ministration on a wide scale. They were the first test population, in a sense, though whether the church thought of it in those clinical terms is unclear. What the law suggests is that the church was genuinely trying to help people at this stage, but the blood therapy was offered with real belief in its benefits, and that the catastrophic consequences were not immediately visible, or perhaps not immediately acknowledged. The blood did help at first. That is the cruel part of this story. The people of Old Yharnam received blood ministration, and many of them got better, recovered from things that should have killed them, lived longer and felt stronger. The church's reputation grew. More blood was administered. The relationship between the citizens and the church deepened into something that looked like gratitude and faith, a community bound together by the miracle of healing. What the church either did not know or chose not to investigate closely enough was what happened to people over long periods of sustained blood use. The initial benefits were real, but the blood was not inert. It carried something in it, a potential, a tendency, a direction that human biology was not built to accommodate without consequence. The scholarly term the game uses is the beastly scourge, and the first signs of it appeared here, in these streets, in these crowded, narrow buildings. Among these people who had been grateful recipients of the church's generosity, the early symptoms were probably subtle enough to be explained away: behavioral changes, increased aggression, a certain animal quality to the eyes. The church's physicians, called healing church workshop hunters at this stage, would have seen these signs and needed to make a decision about what they meant. The law suggests that the initial response was not alarm, but rather adjustment, a modification of dosage, a new treatment protocol, a hope that the problem was correctable. The transformation that the blood initiated, once it reached a certain threshold, was not a disease that medicine could treat. It was a fundamental change in what a person was. The flesh itself began to shift. The mind began to dissolve. What had been a human being started becoming something else, something that retained enough of its former self to be terrifying, but had lost enough of it to be unrecognizable. This is what the law calls going beast. The people of Old Yharnam did not become beasts all at once. The transformation spread through the community over a period of time that the law does not precisely define, but which was probably weeks or months, rather than days. Families watched their members change. Neighbors who had shared meals and conversations began to look at each other with new eyes. The social fabric of the district started to fray as the thing that was happening became impossible to ignore. The church's response during this period is one of the more troubling aspects of the story. The law suggests that there was an effort to contain information rather than contain the disease. The people of the district were encouraged to continue their treatments. Reports of unusual behavior were managed quietly. The healing church had built its entire identity and power structure on the miracle of blood ministration, and acknowledging that the blood was causing this would have been existential for the institution. The hunters of the healing church workshop were dispatched to the district during this period, not to warn the citizens, but to manage the situation. This is a distinction that the game draws carefully. The hunters were effective at killing beasts, but killing beasts in this context meant killing people who had gone too far in their transformation. People who had been neighbors and patients and members of the community. The hunters were operating under church authority and church doctrine, which held that once the transformation was complete, the individual was gone, and only the beast remained. Whether that doctrine was true is a question the game never fully answers, and it is also one of the questions that haunts the entire Bloodborne narrative. The beasts of Old Yharnam were once people. Some of them may retain traces of awareness. The way they move and react suggests something more than simple animal instinct in some cases. The church's position that they were no longer people was convenient, as well as possibly wrong. The healing church workshop hunters killed a great many people in Old Yharnam. They did their jobs with the efficiency that hunters are trained for, and the streets of the district became increasingly empty as the plague progressed and the hunting intensified. But the beasts were not the only problem. The blood itself continued to be administered elsewhere in Yharnam, even as Old Yharnam descended into crisis. The church's solution to the problem was not to stop using blood, but to establish more careful protocols, and eventually to simply seal off the problem area. The society of Old Yharnam, in its final days before the fire, was a community in collapse. Those who had not yet transformed lived in terror of those who had. Families were being broken apart as members were taken by hunters or transformed beyond recognition. The streets that had once been simply cramped and difficult were now actively dangerous, with beasts roaming at night and hunters moving through with lethal purpose during the day. There is evidence in the law that some people tried to fight back, not against the beasts, but against the hunters and the church. The district had a sense of communal identity, the kind that develops in close-knit, lower-class neighborhoods, and some residents appear to have resisted the church's management of the crisis. They may have hidden transformed family members. They may have refused treatment. They may have tried to warn outsiders about what was happening, though the church's control of information would have made this difficult. The beast plague in Old Yharnam was also doing something that the law only hints at, but which becomes clearer when you examine the later chapters of Yharnam's history. It was teaching the church every failure, every transformation, every body that the hunters had to put down was data. The church's scholars and physicians were watching all of this happen and learning from it, and what they learned would shape their approach to blood administration for generations afterward. Old Yharnam was, in a horrible sense, a learning experience for an institution that had the luxury of learning from it, because they were not the ones dying. The beast plague eventually reached a point where the district was considered unrecoverable. The transformation rate was too high, the number of beasts too great, the hunters stretched too thin. The church made a decision that had probably been discussed and delayed, and finally became unavoidable. Old Yharnam would not be saved. It would be burned. But before the fire came, there was one more chapter in the story of the living people of Old Yharnam. A group of them, or possibly a single leader with followers, made a decision to resist, not through hiding or fleeing, but through something more radical. They turned to the beast, not as a curse, but as a weapon. And this faction, which the law associates with what some call the beast-embracing philosophy, would become one of the most significant ideological threads in the entire Bloodborne narrative. The idea that the beast could be wielded, that the transformation was not a fall but an ascension, that the power of the beast could be harnessed without losing the self. This idea did not start in Old Yharnam, but it found fertile ground there, among people who had been given no other options. When the church offered you healing and then tried to kill you for taking it, the church's moral authority became somewhat easier to question. The Pthumerian heritage of Yharnam is relevant here as well. The city was built on top of far older civilization, and the blood that the church was using came ultimately from the chalice dungeons beneath the city, from the ruins of the Pthumerian culture that had conducted its own experiments with Great One blood and paid its own catastrophic price. Old Yharnam sits directly above some of the oldest and deepest sections of these ruins, and the people who lived there may have had more exposure to the lingering influence of that ancient civilization than residents of newer districts. The scourge that hit Old Yharnam may therefore have been more severe, not just because of population density, but because of proximity to the source. The blood used in the district's ministrations may have been more potent, drawn from deeper or older ritual chalices, and the transformation it triggered may have been faster and more extreme than what occurred in other areas. This is speculative, but it aligns with the way the law describes the beasts of Old Yharnam as particularly powerful and particularly far gone. The church's scholars who were studying the scourge in real time would have noted this. The dungeons beneath Old Yharnam were actively being explored by church expeditions during this period, seeking to deepen their understanding of the Pthumerian rituals and acquire more powerful blood variants. The tragedy of Old Yharnam may have been partially produced by the very research efforts that were meant to help. Stronger blood, drawn from deeper in the dungeons, administered to people living directly above the source of that blood, in concentrated doses over a prolonged period, was a formula for what actually happened. The community of Old Yharnam, in its final weeks, was essentially a population being consumed from the inside by something the church had introduced and then failed to control. The hunters in the streets were not rescuers. They were, from the perspective of the people being hunted, another form of predator. The beasts in the buildings were, from the perspective of the church, the entire population reduced to something that needed to be exterminated. And somewhere in between those two perspectives were the actual human beings, the ones who had not yet transformed and were running out of places to hide and running out of time. There were almost certainly children in Old Yharnam. The law does not specify this directly, but the district was a residential neighborhood, and residential neighborhoods have children. What happened to them is not something the game addresses, which is its own kind of statement. The silence around certain questions in Bloodborne is as meaningful as the answers it provides, and the absence of any account of children in Old Yharnam is a silence that has weight. The social structures of the district broke down in stages. First, the commerce, as shops closed and people stopped moving through the streets. Then the informal community networks, as trust between neighbours eroded and people retreated into their own buildings. Then the family unit itself, as transformation made some members dangerous to others. By the time the fire came, Old Yharnam had already ceased to function as a community in any meaningful sense. What remained was individuals in isolated pockets, and beasts filling the space between them. The hunters who were working the district during this period were under enormous psychological strain. The Healing Church Workshop produced hunters who were trained to see clearly, to maintain emotional distance, to understand that sentiment was a liability in their work. But hunting beasts that had recently been people you might have seen on the street, in a district that was still recognizably a neighborhood rather than a monster-filled dungeon, was a different kind of work than hunting in the Chalice depths. Some hunters cracked under it, some became brutal, some became something that the church had to manage in different ways. The law hints at divergences in hunter philosophy that began in this period. The question of how to relate to the beasts, whether they retained humanity, whether killing them was mercy or murder, whether the hunt itself was holy or hollow, these questions did not have clean answers when you were standing in a burning street in Old Yharnam with something that used to be your patient charging at you. The hunters who survived this period carried those questions with them, and those questions eventually became the philosophical fractures that split hunter culture in later generations. One of the key figures who would later emerge in connection with Old Yharnam is Jura, and while his story belongs more properly to a later chapter, his roots are here in understanding what the place was before and during its destruction. Jura was not present for the burning, as far as the law suggests, but he came to understand what had happened there and made a choice based on that understanding that defines his character entirely. To understand Jura, you have to understand Old Yharnam, and to understand Old Yharnam, you have to understand that the people who became beasts were not monsters who wandered in from somewhere else. They were residents, they were patients, they were people who trusted the wrong institution at the wrong time. The architecture of Old Yharnam tells the story of the community's dissolution in physical terms. The buildings closest to the ground level show signs of barricading, of people trying to seal themselves in against the beasts and the hunters both. Higher up, there are structures that suggest watch points, places where survivors might have monitored the streets below. The rooftops and elevated walkways, which the player uses extensively, were probably the last arteries of movement through the district as the ground level became untenable. The beast-embracing faction, or at least those who were moving in that direction philosophically, may have occupied some of the more defensible structures in the district during the final period. The law does not give us a detailed map of factions in Old Yharnam's last days, but there is enough evidence to suggest that the population had fragmented into multiple groups with different survival strategies, and that some of those groups had very different ideas about what the beast was and what it meant. The weapons and equipment found in Old Yharnam's environment tell their own story. The firearms, the blades, the hunter gear scattered through the environment. These suggest that hunters were active in the district for a sustained period and suffered losses there. Hunters dying in a hunting ground means the beasts were capable of killing trained, equipped fighters, which in turn means the people of Old Yharnam had been transforming into something quite formidable before the church decided burning was the only answer. The Healing Church's internal deliberations about Old Yharnam are not directly documented in the law that the game provides, but we can reconstruct the shape of those conversations from the decisions that were made. Someone had to argue for burning. Someone had to sign off on the destruction of an entire populated district. The church that made this decision was not a monolith. It had factions and disagreements, and figures with different amounts of power and different amounts of concern for the people being managed. But the decision was made, which tells us something about which factions won that argument. The fire that would eventually come to Old Yharnam was not the first time the church had used extreme measures in response to the scourge. There is evidence throughout the law of other containment actions, other incidents that were managed through violence rather than medicine. But Old Yharnam was the largest and most consequential of these actions, and it set a precedent that shaped church policy for everything that came after. If you could burn a district, you could burn anything. The logic of containment through destruction, once established, was a logic that would not stay contained to one neighborhood. The citizens who were still alive and human, when the order to burn came, were not given a chance to evacuate. This is one of the details that the law implies rather than states directly, but it is difficult to explain the complete absence of survivors from Old Yharnam in any other way. A controlled evacuation would have left traces, former residents in other districts, records of relocation, some kind of institutional acknowledgement. None of that exists. The church burned Old Yharnam and sealed it, and then did something remarkable in its thoroughness. It largely removed Old Yharnam from the official history of Yharnam entirely. The sealing of Old Yharnam was not just physical. Gates were closed, yes, and the district was cut off from the rest of the city. But there was also a deliberate effort to manage the narrative about what had happened. The official position, as far as there was one, was that Old Yharnam had been cleansed of the beast plague, that the fire had been a necessary medical procedure, and that the area was sealed for safety reasons related to the ongoing scourge, rather than as a measure to conceal evidence of institutional failure and mass death. Later generations of Yharnam residents grew up with Old Yharnam as a cautionary tale, rather than a history. The beasts that still roamed the burned district were described as remnants of an ancient plague, something from before the current church's more careful protocols, a problem that had been handled. The living people who had died there were largely erased from the account. Their names, their stories, their suffering, none of it made it into the version of history that the church wanted circulated. This erasure is itself a significant piece of the law. Bloodborne is deeply interested in the question of what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, and who controls that process. The church's management of the Old Yharnam narrative is an early and clear example of an institution choosing institutional survival over historical truth, and the consequences of that choice echo through everything that happens in the main game's present. The beasts of Old Yharnam did not stop existing just because the district was sealed. They continued to transform, to deepen in their bestial nature over the years and decades after the burning. The fire killed many, but not all, and those that survived continued the process that the blood had initiated, becoming more extreme, more powerful, more fully removed from the humanity they had once possessed. By the time the player arrives in Yharnam, the beasts of Old Yharnam have had generations to become what they are, and what they are is genuinely different from the beasts in the upper city. The sealed district became, over time, something between a prison and a nature reserve, and a mass grave. The church knew it was there. Certain hunters knew it was there, but the official Yharnam above went about its business with this burning wound sealed beneath it, and if people wondered about the smoke that sometimes rose from beyond the sealed gates, they were given official explanations that they probably chose to believe because the alternative was more frightening. The last people of Old Yharnam, who remained themselves, who retained their humanity in those final days before the fire, faced a choice that the law frames as significant. They could submit to the church, which likely meant death either from a hunter's blade or from the flames. They could run, though where they would run to in a sealed and burning city is unclear, or they could embrace what the blood was making of them and meet the end on their own terms. Some of them, the law suggests, chose a version of that third option, and the ideology that emerged from that choice is one of the most philosophically interesting threads in the entire game. The story of Old Yharnam's last days is the story of an ordinary community destroyed by an extraordinary failure of the institution that was supposed to protect it. It is not a story about monsters in the traditional sense. It is a story about people, and about what happens to people when the systems they depend on betray them, and about what those people become when every option available to them involves a form of destruction that is the foundation on which everything else in this law is built. Chapter 2: The Healing Church and its Calculations. The Healing Church did not become the dominant institution of Yharnam by accident. It got there through a combination of genuine medical achievement, careful political maneuvering, and a willingness to make decisions that other institutions would have found unconscionable. Understanding the Church's role in what happened to Old Yharnam requires understanding the Church as an organization, its internal culture, its power dynamics, and the particular way it thought about the relationship between knowledge and harm. The Church was founded on a genuine discovery. The blood of the Great Ones, accessed through the Pthumerian ritual chalices beneath Yharnam, had real healing properties. This was not a fraud or a superstition. People who received blood administration recovered from illnesses that should have killed them. The early church was, by the evidence available to it, doing something miraculous and beneficial, and the faith and institutional confidence that it built in those early years was built on a real foundation. The problem was not that the blood was useless. The problem was that the blood was doing more than healing. It was also, under the right conditions and in sufficient quantities, initiating a transformation in the human body that eventually produced the beast plague. The Church's earliest researchers almost certainly detected signs of this secondary effect before it became publicly catastrophic. The question that the law raises, and does not cleanly answer, is what they did with that knowledge. The Church's internal structure in this period was built around a central distinction between the scholars who studied the blood and its sources, and the practitioners who administered it to patients. The scholars operated in a different epistemic universe than the practitioners. They had access to information that the practitioners did not, including the Pthumerian texts that describe the earlier civilization's experiments with Great One blood and the consequences of those experiments. If those texts said what the history of Yharnam suggests they said, then the Church's scholars knew, at some level, that sustained blood use was dangerous. The institutional response to that knowledge appears to have been a form of managed ignorance. The scholars continued their research, developing deeper understanding of the blood's properties and the Great One's nature. The practitioners continued their ministrations, operating on protocols that the scholars shaped, but without full access to the theoretical framework that informed those protocols. The ordinary people of Yharnam, and particularly the people of Old Yharnam, who were the earliest mass recipients, were at the bottom of this information hierarchy, knowing essentially nothing except that the blood made them feel better. This structure was not unique to the Healing Church. It reflects a pattern common to institutions that possess specialized knowledge and use that specialization as a source of power. The Church's scholars understood that their authority derived partly from the mystification of their knowledge, from the fact that ordinary people could not evaluate or question what they were doing, because they did not have access to the conceptual tools required. Blood ministration was presented as medicine, but experienced by recipients as miracle. And that gap between presentation and experience was something the Church carefully maintained. The decision to continue blood ministration, even as signs of the scourge appeared in Old Yharnam, was made by people operating within this institutional culture. It was not necessarily made by cynical villains who knew exactly what they were causing and did not care. It may have been made by people who genuinely believed the benefits outweighed the risks, or who believed the transformation could be controlled if they just understood it better, or who had enough personal and institutional investment in blood ministration, being good that they could not see clearly what was happening in front of them. The psychology of institutional commitment is relevant here. The Church had built everything on blood: its buildings, its treasury, its political relationships, its healing houses, its hunter apparatus. All of it flowed from the legitimacy that blood administration provided. Acknowledging that blood administration caused the beast plague would have required dismantling not just a policy, but an entire institutional identity. The people at the top of the Church were not just defending a medical protocol, they were defending the foundation of their world. This does not excuse the decisions that were made. The people of Old Yharnam, who became beasts and were hunted and burned, were real, and the institutional considerations that contributed to their deaths were real considerations made by real people who had choices. But understanding the church's psychology helps explain why the response was what it was, why containment rather than honesty was chosen, why burning rather than acknowledgement became the solution. The Healing Church Workshop, the hunter organization that operated under direct church authority during this period, was the instrument through which the church's decisions were executed in Old Yharnam. The workshop hunters were professional killers trained to a very high standard, equipped with the best tools the church's scholars could provide, and operating under a clear mandate: manage the beast problem. That mandate was deliberately vague about what management meant, giving hunters discretion that the church's leadership could later disclaim if necessary. The workshop hunters in Old Yharnam developed a culture specific to that assignment: hunting in an active residential district, hunting among people who might be your neighbours or your former patients, hunting in circumstances where the line between beast and person was often unclear, produced a particular kind of hunter, harder in some ways, more questioning in others. The law suggests that the workshop hunters of this period included some of the most philosophically troubled figures in the entire Bloodborne narrative. People who did what they were trained to do, but could not stop asking whether it was right. The church's management of the workshop during the Old Yharnam crisis involved a degree of information control that bordered on manipulation. Hunters were given operational briefings but not strategic context. They knew what they were supposed to kill and where, but not the full picture of why the situation was as bad as it was, or what the church's scholars knew about its causes. This was partly practical. Hunters do not need to understand blood chemistry to do their jobs, but it was also protective. Hunters who knew the full story might ask harder questions. Some of them figured it out anyway. The fragments of lore associated with various hunter figures from this period suggest that a number of workshop hunters arrived at their own conclusions about the church's responsibility for Old Yharnam through observation and inference. What they did with those conclusions varied. Some continued to serve, finding ways to compartmentalize their knowledge. Some became more brutal, channeling their disillusionment into the work. And some, eventually, broke with the church entirely. The church's scholars, who were most directly involved in the blood research during the Old Yharnam crisis, belong to a category of figure that the game treats with particular complexity. These are people who are genuinely brilliant, genuinely curious, and genuinely dangerous. Not because they were evil, but because they were so focused on what they were trying to understand that they could detach themselves from what that understanding cost other people. The Pthumerian texts, the Great One Communion experiments, the chalice rituals, all of these required a kind of scholarly dedication that the Old Yharnam crisis, from inside the scholar's perspective, might have registered primarily as data. The ethical collapse at the centre of the church's handling of Old Yharnam was the reduction of a community to a research problem. The people of Old Yharnam were patients, then subjects, then obstacles, then waste. That reduction happened incrementally through a series of small decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation. And by the time the burning was ordered, the community of Old Yharnam had been so thoroughly depersonalized within the church's institutional thinking that the fire probably did not feel like mass murder to the people who ordered it. It felt like containment. The church's internal records of Old Yharnam, to the extent that such records existed and were preserved, would tell a different story than the one the church presented publicly. The lore of Bloodborne is full of documents and items that suggest a gap between the church's public narrative and its internal knowledge. And the Old Yharnam case is probably the most extreme example of that gap. What the church knew, what it decided, and what it told everyone are three different things, and the distance between them is where the real horror of the story lives. The blood ministration protocols that the church developed after Old Yharnam were shaped by what had happened there. The new protocols emphasized more careful dosing, more monitoring of recipients, more rapid intervention when signs of transformation appeared. These improvements were real, and they probably prevented some of the immediate chaos of Old Yharnam from being repeated in other districts. But they did not address the fundamental problem, which was that the blood itself was the source of the transformation, and no protocol could fully eliminate that risk. The church also developed, in the aftermath of Old Yharnam, a more sophisticated approach to beast management that went beyond just hunting. The insight that the beast plague was spreading through blood ministration, but could be slowed through careful management, led to the development of the powder kegs, a hunter faction that became notorious for using fire and explosives as tools of containment. The connection between Old Yharnam's burning and the powder keg's signature methods is not coincidental. The church systematized the lesson of Old Yharnam: when everything else fails, fire is the answer. The theology that the church developed around the beast plague also has its roots in the Old Yharnam crisis, the doctrinal position that the fully transformed beast is no longer a person, that hunting it is not murder, but mercy, was necessary to give the workshop hunters psychological cover for what they were doing in Old Yharnam. Whether or not it was theologically sound, it was institutionally necessary, and it was developed and codified during this period in direct response to the problems that Old Yharnam presented. The church's hierarchy, the internal rankings of clergy, scholars, and hunters, became more rigid after Old Yharnam as well. The crisis had revealed that informal information channels and discretionary authority at the practitioner level were risks. If hunters in the field could see too clearly what was happening and develop their own opinions about it, institutional control was threatened. The solution was more hierarchy, more compartmentalization, more formal chains of authority that kept field personnel focused on their immediate tasks rather than the larger picture. The relationship between the church and the city of Yharnam, more broadly, was transformed by Old Yharnam in ways that are not always immediately visible. Before the crisis, the church was powerful, but not absolutely dominant. There were other institutions, other sources of authority, other voices that could challenge the church's decisions in public. After Old Yharnam, and partly through the church's management of the Old Yharnam narrative, many of those alternative voices were quieted. The church had demonstrated that it controlled not just medicine but information, and institutions that controlled information in Yharnam's environment had enormous power. The Upper Cathedral Ward, which would eventually become the centre of the church's most extreme experiments, was developed in the years after Old Yharnam, using the knowledge and resources that the crisis had concentrated in the church's hands. The architecture of the Upper Cathedral Ward is deliberately removed from the rest of Yharnam, elevated and isolated in ways that are both practical and symbolic. The church was putting distance between its most sensitive work and the eyes of the population, and the memory of what happened when sensitive work was conducted too close to ordinary people informed that decision. The blood echoes mechanic in the game, the way that power and memory are bound up in blood in the game's metaphysics, resonates strongly with the Old Yharnam story when you start thinking about it. The church was accumulating power through its management of Old Yharnam, extracting institutional benefit from the crisis, even as the crisis destroyed the community at its centre. The blood of Old Yharnam, quite literally and metaphorically, fed the church's growth. The church's relationship with the Pthumrian ruins beneath Old Yharnam did not end with the burning. The expeditions into the Chalice dungeons continued and in some ways intensified as the church sought deeper understanding of the Great Ones and more powerful variants of the blood. The sealed district above served as cover for these ongoing excavations, keeping the public away from an area where highly sensitive work was being conducted. Old Yharnam, even burned and sealed, was still useful to the church. The hunters who survived service in Old Yharnam carried the experience with them into everything they did afterward. The lore fragments associated with this period suggest that Old Yharnam service was a dividing line in hunter culture, that veterans of the district had a different quality than those who had not served there, harder to read, slower to trust institutional authority, more likely to ask the questions that the church preferred not to be asked. This cohort of veterans was manageable when they remained within the church's structure, but dangerous when they left it. The church dealt with hunters who knew too much or asked too many questions in various ways. Some were promoted into positions where their dangerous knowledge could be absorbed and managed. Some were given more extreme assignments, on the theory that the most questioning hunters were also the best ones and should be pointed at the most difficult problems. And some were simply allowed to burn out, their knowledge dying with them in the hunt, which, from the church's perspective, was probably the cleanest outcome. The legacy of the church's calculations during the Old Yharnam crisis is the entire world of Bloodborne. Every institution that functions in the game's present, every faction, every surviving hunter, every piece of doctrine and dogma bears the imprint of the decisions that were made when Old Yharnam was burning. The church that exists on the night of the hunt is the church that was forged in that fire, and understanding what it decided then helps explain why it is what it is now. The particular cruelty of the church's calculations is that they were not irrational. From an institutional survival standpoint, from a power maintenance standpoint, from a harm limitation standpoint, narrowly defined to exclude the people of Old Yharnam, the church's decisions were logical. Burn the evidence, control the narrative, develop better protocols, increase hierarchy and information control, and continue the mission. The logic is terrible, but it is coherent. And that coherence is what makes it genuinely disturbing, rather than simply villainous. The scholars of the church, who were most deeply involved in the Old Yharnam research and response, eventually pursued paths that took them further and further from anything that could be called ethical medical practice. The knowledge they gained through Old Yharnam was the beginning of a trajectory that led to the Upper Cathedral experiments, to the attempt to contact Great Ones directly, to the production of creatures like ebrietas, and the various nightmare entities that populate the game's more esoteric areas. Old Yharnam was the first step on that path, and the logic that made it possible was the same logic that made every subsequent step possible. The church never publicly acknowledged what it had done in Old Yharnam. There is no law item that describes an official church apology or even an official church admission. The district was sealed, the official narrative was established, and Yharnam moved on. The people who had lived and died there were not mourned publicly or commemorated in any form that the game makes accessible to the player. They were, in institutional terms, simply gone. This absence of acknowledgement is itself a piece of information about the church's character. Institutions that genuinely reckon with their failures develop different cultures than institutions that cover those failures and move forward as if they did not happen. The Church of Bloodborne, as the player encounters it, is an institution that never reckoned with Old Yharnam, and that unreckoned history is present in everything it does and is. The fire is the central image of Old Yharnam for a reason. Fire destroys, but it also purifies, in a cultural and religious sense, and the church almost certainly framed the burning of Old Yharnam internally as an act of purification rather than an act of destruction. The language of purification, of cleansing, of removing corruption, runs through church doctrine as the player encounters it, and that language has its roots in the original decision to burn. If you can call burning a neighborhood full of people a cleansing, you can call almost anything a cleansing, and the church proved itself willing to call almost anything that. The one calculation the church may have miscalculated was what the beasts of Old Yharnam would become over time. Sealing the district rather than completely destroying it, leaving survivors to continue their transformation in an enclosed space for years and then decades, produced a population of beasts that was in some ways more extreme and more dangerous than anything the church had originally dealt with. The sealed district became a pressure vessel, and the beasts within it evolved in the direction that prolonged transformation and isolation and the ongoing influence of the deep blood took them. The church's hunters, who were occasionally sent into the sealed district for various purposes, encountered something different from what their training had prepared them for. The beasts of Old Yharnam were not the recently transformed citizens that the workshop hunters had dealt with during the crisis. They were something older and stranger, and dealing with them required adjustments that gradually fed back into the church's understanding of what the beast transformation actually was and what it was heading toward. the end point of the beast transformation, the question of what a human being becomes after enough time in the bestial state, is something that the deeper Bloodborne lore explores in ways that connect back to Old Yharnam. If the sealed district is where the longest-running uninterrupted beast transformations have been occurring, then it may also be where the answer to that question is closest to visible, and some of the church's later theological and philosophical developments may have been informed by what was observed in Old Yharnam through whatever surveillance or expeditionary capacity the church maintained there after the sealing. The church's calculations, in the end, produced a city that was itself becoming Old Yharnam, slowly and then faster as the game's present approached. The entire upper city, the cathedral ward, the forbidden woods, all of it was following the same trajectory that Old Yharnam had followed, just decades behind, and with better protocols slowing the pace. The burning of Old Yharnam did not solve the problem. It just delayed the reckoning, and the game's present is that reckoning finally arriving. Chapter 3: Jura and the Choice to Remember. Of all the figures associated with Old Yharnam, Jura is the one who confronts the player most directly and most uncomfortably. He is not a villain in any simple sense. He is not a beast. He is not a church operative or a madman. He is a hunter who made a choice, a specific and considered choice based on what he understood about Old Yharnam. And defending that choice is the entire purpose of his existence by the time the player meets him. Jura's background before Old Yharnam is not exhaustively detailed in the lore, but the outlines are clear enough. He was a hunter of the Healing Church workshop, trained and equipped and deployed in the manner of all workshop hunters of his era. He was apparently skilled, surviving assignments that claimed other hunters, and he accumulated the kind of experience and reputation that brought him eventually to Old Yharnam. When he arrived there, or when he came to understand fully what Old Yharnam was and what the church had done there, something in him shifted permanently. The specific mechanism of Jura's disillusionment is something the player can piece together from his dialogue and from the lore of the Powder Kegs, the hunter faction he eventually joined. The Powder Kegs were a heretical workshop offshoot. Hunters who disagreed with the workshop's methods and the church's control and struck out independently. The name reflects their preference for unconventional, destructive weapons, the kind that the church found excessive and uncontrolled. But the deeper identity of the Powder Kegs was about their relationship to the church's authority and specifically to the church's narrative about the beast plague. Jura and the Powder Kegs did not believe that the beasts of Old Yharnam were simply monsters to be managed. They believed, or came to believe, that the beasts retained something of their humanity, that the people inside the transformations were not entirely gone, and that the church's doctrine of the fully transformed beast as non-person was a convenient lie that served the church's institutional interests rather than the truth. This is a position that the game itself does not fully confirm or deny, keeping the question open in the way that Bloodborne keeps most of its deepest questions open. Jura's position, at the top of the tower in Old Yharnam, is the physical expression of his ideological commitment. He is not there to hunt beasts, he is there to protect them. Specifically, he is there to protect the beasts of Old Yharnam from other hunters, from people like the player character who come into the sealed district armed and ready for blood. His enormous Gatling gun is not aimed at the beasts below. It is aimed at the hunters above. This inversion of the expected hunter posture is immediately striking when you understand what it represents. The choice to stand guard over Old Yharnam, to become its protector rather than its exterminator, required Jura to give up everything that a hunter's life normally provides: status within the church structure, the camaraderie of workshop hunters, access to the resources and support systems that institutional affiliation provided. Jura is alone in Old Yharnam, which in practical terms means he has given up human community to stand watch over beings that most of his former colleagues consider non-human. The sacrifice embedded in his position is significant. His dialogue with the player, when you reach him without killing the beasts below, is one of the most affecting exchanges in the game. He speaks about the beasts of Old Yharnam with a combination of sorrow and protectiveness that is not the language of a person talking about monsters. He says things that imply he sees them as victims as people who suffered a great wrong and deserve to be left in whatever peace they can find. He asks the player to leave them alone, to let them have the place that was theirs before the church made it into what it is. There is a reading of Jura's position that sees it as a form of guilt. He was a workshop hunter who operated in or around the Old Yharnam crisis, and if he participated in the hunting that occurred there before the burning, then his current guardianship could be understood as penance. He cannot undo what was done to the people of Old Yharnam. He cannot restore them to what they were, but he can stand between them and the next round of hunters who come looking for blood echoes in a sealed district. It is not much, but it is what he has. The Powder Keg Hunters, as a faction, had a specific and documented disagreement with the Healing Church Workshop over the use of trick weapons and fire-based tools. The church found the Powder Kegs' methods excessive and hard to control, preferring the cleaner, more surgical approach of conventional hunter combat. But there is a bitter irony in the church complaining about excessive fire use, given that the church itself had burned Old Yharnam to the ground. The Powder Keg's embrace of fire and explosives reads differently when you understand that context. They were not celebrating destruction. They may have been insisting on honesty about what the church's tools actually were. Jura's connection to other characters who appear in Bloodborne's present is limited, but suggestive. He has a hunter set and items associated with him that can be obtained if you kill him, and those items tell part of his story. The Jura's set description suggests a hunter who saw clearly and was changed permanently by what he saw. The weapons associated with the Powder Kegs are characterized by their reliance on uncontrolled power, on effects that spread beyond their intended target, which resonates with the Powder Keg's philosophical commitment to not pretending that the hunt was cleaner than it was. The fact that Jura is still alive on the night of the hunt, or whatever version of alive an old hunter standing in a burning ruined district constitutes, suggests something about his particular relationship to the curse that is afflicting Yharnam. The hunt, in the game's present, is, in various ways, an intensification of everything that has always been wrong with Yharnam, and most characters caught in it are either dead, transformed, or consumed by madness. Jura is none of these things. He is old and isolated, and probably not entirely sane in the conventional sense, but he retains himself, his values, his purpose, his voice. The commitment to remembering and protecting what Old Yharnam was seems to have given him a kind of stability that many other characters lack. His reaction to the player killing Old Yharnam's beasts is extreme. He becomes immediately hostile, and if you have already had a peaceful conversation with him, the betrayal in his response is palpable. He does not speak calmly about his disappointment. He does not attempt negotiation. He simply fights, and fights hard, because from his perspective, the player has just done what every other hunter has always done in Old Yharnam: killed people who were already suffering. The extremity of his reaction